And welcome to day 3 of the Illinois Environmental Health Association Spring Virtual Conference. Just a few housekeeping notes. No need to introduce yourself into the chat box if your username is your first and last name. If it is not, you can either change your username by kind of right-clicking on your own profile and hitting rename, or you can send me a private chat with your first and last name so that we make sure that you are accounted for with continuing education credits. Our first session for today is an introduction to manufactured food and shellfish sanitation. So I will stop sharing my screen here and turn it over to Dara.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm very excited to introduce this presentation from 2 of our FDD staff to talk about manufactured food and shellfish. I know when I came into my role as food program manager, my background was primarily in retail food. And so I had a lot of misconceptions about how manufactured food was regulated and how it was inspected. And so it's been really amazing to learn from our regional staff and our great team. So here today is our manufactured food program coordinator, Steve Hahn, who's going to start us off, and our shellfish officer, Sandra Robinson. And I'll be here to help with anything else or questions and look through the chat. So Steve.
All right, thank you, Dara. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
All right, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Just a second. For some reason, I'm having an issue with going into presentation mode.
Right where your mouse is, where it just was, on the top kind of left orange bar, there's a little, looks like a podium, and you should be able to click that and it will take you to presentation mode.
Yeah, some reason I'm having an issue with it.
Hey, Steve, I see another podium down the bottom, toward the bottom right where the volume area is, right to the left of it. You see that?
Right there?
Try that.
Oh, there we go. Sorry, guys. Technical issues on my part. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Steve Hahn. I have been with the with the Illinois Department of Public Health since 2017. And I started out in the Peoria region as an inspector for the food program and the dairy program and our tanning and body art program. And then I moved to the central office in 2019, and I've been working in the manufactured food programs ever since. And so today I'm going to present to you about our manufactured food program. And when Dara and I were discussing this program, we thought it might be just good to go over some of our most frequently asked questions that we get, so that individuals can be all on the same page. That was kind of our hope with having this presentation today, was to get everybody kind of on the same page about what is manufactured food and what is not manufactured food. All right, so as far as wholesale and manufactured food, we get this question a lot. Is there a difference between wholesale and manufactured food? Is there a definition that you can point us to as far as what exactly is wholesale food or what is manufactured food? And so for us, we use the terms wholesale food and manufactured food interchangeably. We don't really have a difference between those terms. And partly that's because we only regulate wholesale. We don't regulate retail sales. So there are we don't really deal with retail. In terms of an actual definition in our regulations, we don't really have a exact definition in our regulations, and neither does FDA for their part. So sometimes it's kind of hard to figure that out. And occasionally we'll have to ask other individuals to weigh in on whether or not a firm is doing wholesale or not. So for us, what we tell firms is that when they're doing wholesale, we define that as basically selling from one firm to another firm, and basically there's different ownership. You know, it's not distribution within the same firm with the same ownership. So, you know, another way of looking at it is a firm is not selling to the end user who's going to consume the product. There are some variations on that, but that definition holds up for the most part in terms of what is wholesale. Now, in terms of what's not wholesale, and we put this on this slide because we get a lot of questions, it seems like, involving online retail sales. I'm not sure if that's because firms believe that because they're selling across state lines, or they're selling across maybe multiple counties, that they would be under our wholesale rules. Sometimes we get told that they were told by a local health department that because they're doing online retail sales, that would make them a wholesale firm, or a manufactured firm would probably be a better way of saying it. Just because it's online, crosses state lines, crosses different counties, doesn't make it wholesale. If it's retail and it's directly being sold to the end user, we would not consider that wholesale. And the same thing about stores who sell to multiple maybe individuals across, you know, they aren't necessarily online sales, but they're, you know, selling to people through the mail, you know, as retail operations. Now, the other issue that we kind of see sometimes is that you may have a facility that has a central kitchen, and they will do distribution within their own organization to multiple retail establishments. And occasionally there's a question, because it's being processed in a central kitchen that's not on site, would that make it manufactured food, wholesale food? And for us, we've determined that, you know, if it's the same organization, it's the same ownership, and you're going from one firm location to another firm location, there's not really any change in ownership, that's retail in our opinion. But if you had franchisees where you had multiple owners, you have a central kitchen selling to multiple groups of owners, then we would consider that wholesale. And there's also some issues that revolve around specialized processing of seafood and juice HACCP, where it may be a case-by-case basis, even in that scenario, where we would ask for more information from the firm to determine if it's wholesale. So sometimes, you know, the best way to look at this is to just ask us what our opinion is, and we will respond to you and give you how we feel what's going on in this organization, whether or not it's wholesale or retail. The other kind of issue we run into with wholesale is that in Illinois, there are no minimum threshold as far as the regulations, as far as when wholesale rules kick in. You know, other states, the FDA have rules revolving when wholesale regulations would become applicable. In Illinois, if you're doing any wholesale, you would be subject to our regulations. So we've kind of talked about changing that definition to be more in line with the FDA version of that. But at the present time, you know, any wholesale, doesn't matter if it's just selling to one other company, would be regulated by IDPH. In terms of another question we get a lot is, what does IDPH regulate, and what does the Illinois Department of Agriculture regulate? And, you know, it's almost easier to identify what IDOA regulates than what we regulate, because we kind of regulate everything else. So for meat and poultry, shell eggs, catfish, animal feed, and licensed cannabis facilities, those are regulated by ag. And then everything else would be under us. Occasionally, you'll find that the same firm might be making products that are regulated by both entities. The example we usually use is the frozen pizza manufacturer. So if you have a frozen pizza manufacturer and they're making a pizza with meat toppings, that would be regulated by Department of Agriculture, but the same facility is making a cheese pizza, that would be regulated by IDPH. So it's not uncommon to have facilities do both, have both agencies regulate them. Now, in terms of our regulations that we have for wholesale food, our Part 730 code is the code that we use for our regulations, and basically it covers any manufacturing, processing, packing, or holding of food. It also covers basically a lot of federal regulations. And so what I wanted to spend a little bit of time is talking about those federal regulations that are incorporated by reference in our Part 730 code. And so the first one is 21 CFR Part 117, which is the Food Safety Modernization Act, or FSMA. This is kind of our main regulation as it pertains to manufactured food. The inspections that we do for manufactured food, our inspection reports basically follow 21 CFR Part 117, and so when we go to most facilities, what we're going to look at is their current good manufacturing practices, which is outlined in subpart B of this act. Other regulations that we have adopted by reference include seafood HACCP, juice HACCP, and our shellfish ordinance, which Sanders is going to talk about some. We've currently adopted the 2013 version, but there's also a 2019 version that's not been yet adopted. As far as what permits do we need for wholesale or manufactured food, I think some of you might be surprised to know that IDPH does not have a wholesale or manufactured food permit or license. IDPH has approximately 4,000 facilities registered in our system, but there's not a requirement for them to get a food permit or license, with a couple exceptions which are noted on the slide. So what we do have is a voluntary registration. And so what does a voluntary registration mean? Basically, it means that a firm does not have to notify us prior to beginning operations. They don't have to have an inspection prior to beginning operations. There is not a requirement for them to have routine inspections. They don't have to notify us when they move. They don't have to notify us if they have a change in ownership or they go out of business. So it is something we've talked quite a bit about in the program, is adding a permit for manufactured food or a wholesale permit and charging fees for that. But at the present time, any manufactured food facility that is in Illinois does not have to register with us or get a permit with us. So we do have some permits though for bottled water plants, bottled water sources, and for salvage firms. So let's talk a little bit about those. In terms of our bottled water program, we have an in-state bottled water plant license and a in-state bottled water source license. Those facilities must be inspected and licensed each year. I think they run usually from January 1 to December 31st. And there is a routine inspection that's done annually for that. The fee for that license is $150. There's also an out-of-state license, or even out of country. If you're out of country, even you have to get a license with us if you're going to distribute bottled water in Illinois. Again, that's another $150. It's an annual renewal where people will renew that permit. When we do an inspection of a bottled water plant, one of the things we will look at is their monitoring that takes place. So there are requirements and record keeping for any testing of the water source and as well as the finished product at a bottled water facility. And so, you know, they have a lot of testing requirements that they have to adhere to. And so this is our Safe Bottled Water Act. You can find more information. In terms of our salvage program, a lot of you may not be familiar with salvage. Basically, salvage refers to items that are either distressed, maybe they have, they're close to the expiration date or best by date or use by date. But there's a reason why a firm may or may not want to sell that product. So a lot of times with grocery stores, if there's maybe there's some tears in the outer packaging and they don't, want to sell it, they'll send it back to a distributor and then the distributor will sell it on to another vendor to get rid of the product. There's basically not a food safety issue with the product. There is an issue with the like quality potentially, or just a general look of the merchandise. So those firms that engage in salvage are required to get a license from us that renews every year. And there are basically 4 types of salvage license that we have. We have the wholesale, for-profit, non-for-profit, and then we do have a retail for-profit and retail non-for-profit. Currently, we only inspect the non-for-profit facilities. The non-for-profit facilities are typically what we are food banks, to give you an example. So maybe some of the larger food banks that distribute to smaller food banks would be the wholesale not-for-profit, and then the retail not-for-profit would be like a local food bank. Same thing for the for-profit facilities. A lot of those are also, the retail for-profit are also retail establishments. A lot of times you will find those to be like grocery stores in small communities like Amish or Mennonite grocery stores who make baked goods, and they also have a retail for-profit salvage license. So those are the typical type of facilities we have for salvage. And there's also a separate code for salvage, the Part 725 code. So how would a firm register with IDPH if they chose to register with us? There's a manufactured food application that you can find on our website. The manufactured food application, the easiest way to get to it, I tell people, is to just Google search IDPH manufactured food application, and that will take you right to the application. So after a firm registers with us, we will process the application, and then we will assign it to a regional office supervisor. And then that supervisor will assign it to an inspector to do an initial inspection. Again, it's not a required inspection in our act, on our rules, but it is something we prioritize in our program. And we try to do those inspections as soon as we can. But still, sometimes it takes a couple weeks, sometimes it takes a couple months. It just depends on the assigned inspector and their schedule. And once the inspection is completed, the inspection report is going to be issued, and that inspection report is going to have a facility ID number on it. And that is a number that shows that the firm has been inspected by IDPH and is approved for wholesale. We do not issue permits. We do not issue any other documentation to the firm, just the inspection report. So what types of inspections are conducted by IDPH? Usually we do initial inspections. We try to do them before they become operational if we can, but again, it's not required. We'll do complaints. We get complaints from all kinds of sources, health departments, other federal agencies, other state agencies, consumers, all kinds of things. And then we do what we call FDA contract inspections. And so a lot of you may not be familiar with that. Basically, IDPH is hired by FDA to complete inspections every year. These inspections are done under a contract, and it's basically renewed every year. And it helps FDA meet their congressional mandate to inspect facilities. Basically, they have to inspect high-risk facilities every 3 years, and then anything else every 5 years. And because of COVID, FDA is actually very far behind on that mandate. So they're always trying to get us to do more inspections if we can. So, and pretty much most of the states have a contract with FDA to do GMP inspections, basically, and other specialized types of inspections. And then we also do routine inspections for our bottled water program, bottled water sources, and salvage. In terms of types of inspections that we might do, when one of our inspectors might do a GMP inspection, a bottled water inspection, salvage, shellfish, seafood, juice, acidified. Preventive controls, I wanted to spend a little bit of time on that. Basically, preventive controls is another type of inspection that's much more in depth than a GMP inspection. So GMP is part of the preventive controls inspection. Usually an inspector may spend a couple hours to a day for a GMP inspection, but for a preventive controls inspection, they're usually there multiple days. They're going to observe all aspects of that product from basically when it's received to where it's stored, through the processing, packaging, and storing of it, and then ultimately distribution. And so there's a lot of record review. There's a lot of time that's spent looking at how the firm handles the processing, whether they're doing it appropriately, and if necessary, if there's a hazard, how are they controlling that hazard with the preventive control. So there's just a lot more involved with that type of inspection than a GMP inspection. And so we only usually do preventive controls inspection as part of our FDA contract. The last one on here is cannabis cultivation centers, cannabis infusers, and craft growers. The license is through the Department of Agriculture, but there is an inspection requirement for us to do a pre-operational inspection of these facilities. So I was going to spend a little bit of time talking about that. So we only inspect licensed cannabis facilities. We do not inspect any hemp processing firms. And even though there's lots of them that ask us if they, that want us to do inspections, we will not inspect those. Outside of the licensed facilities, we would consider any CBD or THC products to be adulterated. So, we're only doing what's required by the Act. The medical and the adult use cannabis rules require this pre-operational inspection. And so it's a one-time inspection, and we go in there before they start. And then if there's ever any kind of issues, we would refer that to the Department of Ag as far as enforcement. But if there's complaints, we'll go back. If there's an addition onto the building or there's a major remodel, we will go back. Or if the Department of Agriculture requests that they want us to go back, we would do another inspection. But pretty much they're one-time inspections, and that's all we really have to do with these facilities. As far as contact information for the food program, we have the manufactured food program has their own central email. It's the dph.mfgfood@illinois.gov. So if you have wholesale manufactured food questions, please send those to that address. If you have retail food questions or complaints, please contact the DPH Food email address. It doesn't really matter either way. It'll get to the person it needs to get to. So we just kind of ask that you kind of route the questions that way, just to make it a little easier on our end. But, those are the best ways to get a hold of someone with our food program. And then here is my contact information. So you can always email me if you need to. And, I'm happy to help and answer questions as necessary to help facilitate, anything that you guys are doing. And, if you want us to look up a firm, if they're registered with us or anything else, we're happy to help you guys as much as we can. So I'm going to turn it over to Sandra Robinson now to talk about his shellfish sanitation. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let's see. I can find it on here. I think it's right here. Yes. Okay, can everybody see this?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so again, my name is Sandra Robinson. I'm a state shellfish officer, and I'm accredited through the FDA for the work I do for the state and for the FDA in essence. And I've been doing this, I'm trying to figure out when I did start doing this, but I've been an officer since 2019. I have been inspecting shellfish under a normal inspector role before that, but anyway, so I've been a part of IDPH in the food program, working with them since 2015, doing all sorts of inspections as Steve talked about, but I'm one of two shellfish officers in the state. My supervisor is the other. His name is Scott Sebeski. So if you need to contact either of us, you can also contact him. But I'll give you my contact information specifically at the end of this presentation. So let me get this into screen mode real quick to make sure. There we go. Okay. So what we focus on the shellfish program is our molluscan shellfish, and examples of each of the main three are here on this slide. Mussels in the top left, clams in the bottom left, and oysters on the shell on the right hand side. So these, what you see here is how they may appear in a retail location that's selling these types of seafood. The other types of shellfish we regulate, although we don't see them nearly as much out there under the ordinance I'm going to talk about as these three, but it would be scallops as well. But if the shucked scallop product is only the adductor mussel, then we don't cover that under the shellfish ordinance. So basically, in a nutshell, we cover live, shucked, and frozen shellfish. Okay. So why are we really concerned about shellfish? It's because they're filter feeders. They concentrate pathogens in the harvesting areas in the coastal regions where they're grown. They can be exposed to sewage pathogens, naturally occurring microorganisms, bacterial toxins, chemicals that may be from runoff from farmland. A particular organism we are concerned about, and I'll talk about more about that in a minute, are Vibrio species. Listeria as well. They can grow in shellfish tissue with time and temperature abuse. Shellfish poisoning can happen, and that what I mean by poisoning is someone that consumes a shellfish becomes poisoned by the toxins that microorganisms may leave in the shellfish tissues as the shellfish consume those microorganisms. That's a concern. And I talked about the ag chemicals already. Some of the shellfish may be grown in aquaculture ponds in harvesting areas. So if they're not wild caught, then that's how they're grown. So we have to take into consideration agriculture drugs that are used in those waters. So that's a reason why we look at this in detail. Also, for the growing waters, this state and foreign partners, including Canada and Korea, New Zealand, and Mexico, they'll classify these waters and say, okay, yeah, they're clean enough to grow the shellfish in. You can do it during these certain times of the year. So that is a requirement as well under the ordinance. Regardless, bootlegging, as you can probably imagine what I'm talking about here, can still be a factor in shellfish-borne illnesses, where you've got potential harvesters going into waters that should not be used for growing the shellfish. They may not be clean enough. The other issue is shellfish, as you know, and some of you may consume them regularly, are consumed whole, either raw or partially cooked. So that's another concern we have. So what happened over the years? I mean, this is a decades-old program, really, many decades. So eventually the FDA, states, industry partners that are dealers in this whole system came up with a national shellfish sanitation program. And the purpose of the program is to reduce the risk of illness associated with raw shellfish consumption. Now, if this link is not this is not hot linked on this slide, you can always just Google the National Shellfish Sanitation Program, And the latest guide online through the FDA is from 2019. There was just a biannual meeting between FDA, state, and industry partners, March of this year. So another update to the guide may happen down the road soon, as far as the ordinance is concerned. But the other thing I want to talk about is this is particularly important for for the local health departments that are doing inspections of retail locations that handle shellfish, is make sure that that the retailers are looking on the dynamic interstate shellfish shippers list on the FDA website regularly to make sure that the shellfish they're getting from their suppliers is listed. Okay, make sure that that dealer is listed, but we'll go into more detail about that in a little bit. So it's a cooperative program, like I've said, the tripartite program between federal, state, and industry dealers. So the FDA audits us, the states for the coastal states for the cleanliness of their waters, and even inland states like us, Illinois, for our shellfish program in general, and how we are inspecting facilities that handle shellfish in the state, how the wholesalers. I talked about the conference already. So let's move on. I want to talk now about what our responsibilities are at the state level, and as far as how we deal with the wholesalers, the dealers of shellfish. We consult with potential wholesale dealers in the state who have applied to the program. What we look for as far as HACCP is, we want a shellfish specific plan, not just the shellfish should be part of a seafood HACCP plan, but a specific pulled apart plan for shellfish specifically. The focus is on the receiving, storage, and transport, and that's in and outbound, okay? Temperature controls for pathogen growth. That's the big thing in order to inhibit any, hopefully, microbial growth that may be harboring inside the muscle tissue or other types of shellfish tissue. We need to control temperature all throughout the supply chain. We look at a review of records that will demonstrate control of the pathogen growth hazard, temperatures during transport, receiving, and storage, and calibration accuracy records of the thermometers used. So that same shellfish HACCP plan also needs to focus on the receiving records, including tags, and I'll talk more about tags in detail in just a little bit, as a control point that demonstrates shellfish are from approved certified dealers. A review of these records and sales records need to show that both can be connected for traceability purposes. Corrective action records in case any critical limits, temperature or otherwise, are exceeded, what actions were taken as far as the disposition of the product. In other words, was it embargoed? Was it disposed of? What happened? And what measures were taken to prevent the occurrence from happening again? We also look at sanitation, just like typical GMP inspection, the main 8 key areas. We inspect those when we do a walkthrough of the facility that handles shellfish. And we verify that the facility has potable water. We look at water quality reports from the municipality that supplies the firm on a yearly basis. We look at those annual quality reports. And we also look at water bills to make sure that they're getting it from a licensed municipal facility. Okay. So, okay, here's an example of what a tag may look like that comes with, in this case, netted bags of shell stock, okay, that may be shipped from a dealer to, let's say, a retailer, whether it's a restaurant or a grocer. These tags should have on them the original shipper's certification number, and it has a state abbreviation, the particular facility by number within that state, and what that facility does has a code here. This is SS, which stands for shell stock shipper. So that particular facility, it says just shipper, but they can also repack shell stock. Okay, these are live shellfish. All right, they're able to repack them and ship them out. So we'll get them in one form from their dealer, and they may want to parse them out into different amounts before they sell them to retail locations, let's say. And in that case, if that happens, they have to put their own tag on the shipment of shellfish before it goes out, and that's what happened in this case. The harvest date, original harvest date has to be on there. Of course, this is an older tag from 2014, but I put this up here intentionally for a reason I'll explain in a minute. Shipping date, harvest location, it states over here, although this is cut off, it says farm raised, the type of shellfish, what the quantity is in units, that's important. And this was blotted out, but the reshipper's certification number should be on this tag as well. It does list the reshipper, and of course the reminders and cautionary statements that need to be on the tags, and I'll talk more about that later. But the main thing I want to talk about here is what we used to have was this statement about the 90-day retention period for tags. And if you look on the slide, you can see why we do that. We base it off of the most hazardous type of bacterial contamination that may occur in shellfish. And that happens to be hepatitis A virus, actually a virus, not a bacterial species. So that's what we based off of, a typical shelf life for the product. That's across the board, but what a typical incubation period for infection might be from this particular virus, medical diagnosis and confirmation, how many days that might take, number of days on average it might take to report the cases, how long on average a typical epidemiological investigation may take. So that totals 90 days. So you want to have a good safety factor there in terms of the number of days to retain these tags. And that's where they came up with this figure. Now, the change in that statement has happened since 2018. This tag was from 2014 on the left. The one on the right is from a more recent tag. Basically, the language had changed to state that, the FDA and us at the state level want retailers to keep the tag on file in chronological order for 90 days. And then it also states, in addition, retailers date when last shellfish from this container was sold or served. That's very important to put on those tags. And as on backup records that the retailer should hopefully keep on hand as a backup in case tags are lost. And of course, the other statements, perishable keep refrigerated, and informing your customers the typical medical condition statements and so forth. For compromised individuals, cautioning them against consuming these shellfish. But again, I'll talk more about that in a little bit. So these other shelf acronym terms, we got shucker packers. Those are typically located at the coastal states or nearby. Those are the organizations or firms that will shuck the meat out of the shell stock and will pack them. So that's what they do. So that's a different type of designation. Repackers, they can take either shucked meat that they receive from a shucker packer, and they may pack it into different size containers for shipment out to their customers. I talked about shell stock shipper already. A reshipper, that's the type of firm that is by far the most common type of firm we have in Illinois, reshippers. So basically, they receive the shell stock in bags or frozen shellfish, let's say, in boxes. In that case, with boxes, those have labels that don't have as much information on them as the tags do for the shell stock. But in any event, it's basically, as they say, box in, box out. The shell stock and or the frozen shellfish, there's no repackaging going on. Okay, it's box in, box out. That's what the reshippers do. Depuration, that's a newer term. We don't have any depurators in the state. It's basically a type of process where shell stock are put in clean water tanks, and they're allowed to filter clean water for a period of time in order to hopefully remove pathogens from their tissues before they are allowed to be put back into commerce for sale. So anyway, I think that covers everything I want to talk about on that slide, other than to say, even though that 90-day period was based off of hepatitis A, in Illinois, the most common type of infection we've seen is Vibrio type from Vibrio species. And that is through oyster consumption. So for all you, this county health department inspectors, and if there's retailers online, or, if you want to talk to your retailers, make sure they're aware, just heads up, most of the infections we've seen lately, at least from 2018, 19, 21 and 22, we haven't verified the data yet necessarily, and this comes from the communicable disease section at IDPH. This is the information I got from them. Those, years all had high concentrations of Vibrio in oysters compared to other types of infections or other types of shellfish. So that's something to be aware of. So again, I talked about labels on frozen shellfish. You will also find labels, as some of the county health inspectors have seen, on containers of shucked molluscan shellfish. So those aren't as specific as far as the information that's required on them. They'll have the name, address, and certification number of the shucker packer, or the in that case. And so that's what you'll find on, as far as what's on containers of shucked shellfish. So now let's move to basically retailer responsibilities, and that's why I really wanted to focus on this today, because when we've done epidemiological investigations in the state, and we've looked at outbreaks, it's been hard to do traceability and to try and find the source of the infection if the retailers are not keeping accurate records or keeping the tags. It makes it much more difficult to trace the issue. So that's why I wanted to just, a lot of this is review, but on the retail end, but I wanted to go over this anyway. Shellfish should be received in non-returnable packages or containers which bear a legible tag or label that identifies the dealer, a sell by or best if used by date, or the date shucked for shucked shellfish in containers. And if there's no tag on the shell stock that are in the mesh bags, or if there's no label present on the shucked shellfish containers, or if any information is missing that's vital, the product should be placed under embargo until the proper disposition can be determined for that product. So accurate identification is important in case a disease outbreak occurs for research reasons, right? And it also prevents commingling. You shouldn't ever commingle different lots of shellfish. Even though they have the same type of allergen, you should not commingle them, because if we're trying to do traceability on an outbreak, we can't mix lots, because that'll just confuse everything and won't be able to trace. So, and more information on not returning containers to dealers. The reason we do that is because we don't want to confuse the issue, confuse what's really in the contents of the container if that former label isn't removed and replaced with a current label that contains the actual current lot of shellfish. So that can screw things up as well. So we'd like to be able to return and reuse containers for recycling purposes, but in this case, they should not be. Okay. Also, let's see, storing raw food in packages. This is the other caveat for shell stock. Storing the raw food in packages, covered containers, or wrappings does not apply to shell stock. Therefore, it's vitally important that the shell stock is separated and segregated from other raw and ready-to-eat raw foods, including fish, sushi, fruits, and vegetables, to prevent cross-contamination with bacteria or allergens. It's vitally important. Okay. Shellfish may not be removed from the container in which they are received other than immediately before sale or preparation for service. Shellfish from one tagged or labeled container shall not be commingled. I've talked about that already with shellfish from another container with different certification numbers, et cetera, before being ordered by the consumer. So while in storage, before being sold, you can't commingle. You can't remove them from the containers, okay? The original containers they came in. For display purposes, however, shell stock or in-shell product may be removed from the container in which they are received, displayed on drained ice or held in a display container in a quantity specified by a consumer, may be removed from the display or container if the source is identified and recorded and the shell stock or product protected from contamination. Okay, that's the basic gist of everything here. And keep records. Once you start pulling that shell stock or shucked shellfish out of the original containers, make sure you're keeping all the label information, all of the tag information, and double record the information as well to be safe. Okay, have a backup record for traceability purposes. Okay. All right. Let's see. Shucked shellfish may be removed from the container in which they were received and held in a display container from which individuals servings are dispensed upon a consumer's request if the labeling information is retained and correlated to the dates when or dates during which shellfish was sold or served. Okay. Shucked shellfish may be removed container in which they were received and repacked in consumer self-service containers where allowed. So maybe you have different rules in your county where you may not allow that to happen in some of your retail locations. I'm not sure, but according to the FDA retail food code, which is where all this is coming from, you can do this if the labeling information for each shellfish is on each container, consumer self-service container. The labeling information is retained and correlated with the date when or dates during which the shellfish are sold or served. The labeling information is maintained for 90 days, and that information item or part 3 here, that should be on anything to do with pulling shellfish from the original containers and selling to consumers. Keep that information for 90 days. And the shellfish are protected from contamination, of course. So other things to look at, just to be aware of or remind you, consumer self-service of unpackaged raw RT shellfish at buffets or salad bars is allowed. Shellfish may be served or offered for sale upon consumer request if the customer is not amongst a highly susceptible population group. Well, you're not going to know that necessarily, and they may not identify themselves as such, and that's why we have these consumer advisories and and warning messages and so forth that we need to put on the tag or label information, right? Or that you need to display that needs to be displayed at the retail locations. Parasite destruction, which you would normally do with fish that's going to be sold raw. Parasite destruction beforehand by a way of freezing is not required for shellfish or a scallop product that only contains the shucked adductor muscle. So that's important to remember. Okay, now onto the disclosure and reminder examples. Oysters on the half shell. That's a typical label that a retailer would want to put on the display where that is occurring on ice. Okay. Asterisking, sorry, the shellfish to a footnote that states the item is served raw or undercooked and that written safety information is available upon request. That's an option for retailers to make available to their consumers. Consuming raw or undercooked shellfish may increase your risk of foodborne illness, especially if you have certain medical conditions. And that's the statement you saw in the tag example earlier. That's an option. Communication material examples, brochures, deli case or menu advisories, label statements, table tents, placards. Okay. All right. Now, one thing we've run across, I know I and another inspector have gone to a retail location in Chicago before. For instance, we ran across this, we found display tanks that were being used illegally. They cannot be used to store or display for sale, shellfish, okay? Need to be marked for display only. You can get a variance at the retail level from a regulatory authority, and a HACCP plan are needed in order to store and sell from the tank. Strict water quality monitoring, including filtering and disinfection systems is required. You can't have any water flowing from fish tanks into the shellfish tanks, and that's obvious anyway because of the mixing of allergens between fish and shellfish. The safety and quality of the shellfish must remain the same as received. That's kind of difficult to track, but you've got to be able to show that somehow through evidence if you're going to want to store and display for sale from a tank. The identity of the source of the shell stock must be retained. So again, keeping those tag and label records, okay? So, shellfish may filter and concentrate pathogens, as you know, in the harvesting areas, but they can also do it in these tanks, and that's why we're concerned about tanks. We're concerned about the storage of numerous shellfish under limited water volume conditions, allowing for pathogen concentration. That's why we don't normally allow sales out of tanks, unless there are special variances and plans put together to do that. Okay, some distribution issues before I end that we've run across lately. Transporting shellfish across state lines from retailers licensed in one state who receives a dealer certified shellfish and sells direct to consumer in an Illinois county. It's allowed without that particular firm being licensed as a dealer in that state that they came from. And that's according to the FDA. They confirmed that with me. However, FDA also states the out-of-state retailer needs to meet any Illinois County Health Department retail requirements. So you as county health inspectors, you have the authority to, impose your codes and inspect based on your codes, even though these out-of-state retailers may be selling shellfish to consumers in your county. In addition, if the out-of-state retailer is selling to other certified dealers, grocers, restaurants, or wholesalers, a certification is required under the national program. Okay, so keep that in mind. Another example of a distribution issues we've had involve shellfish distributors in one state, not in Illinois, that is not a part of the national program and sells to retail in an Illinois county. The Illinois retailer should only accept, in any case, Illinois retailers should only accept shipments from dealers listed on the interstate certified shellfish shippers list. The FDA Retail Food Code points this out. However, according to the FDA, each state has different requirements for intrastate shipments. Even some states that participate in the national program allow shipping to retailers where the dealers are not listed on the shippers list. And of course, this is also true of states that are not part of the national program. So any questions? You can, I assume some of you may have left some in the chat, and we'll address those if we can, if time allows. I think we do have a little bit of time before 2, yes. If not, please contact me. Here's my contact information. I'll leave this slide up as long as I can. Or contact my supervisor, Scott Sobeski. That's scott@illinois.gov. So with that, I guess I will turn it over to Dara, I guess, if we want to address any chat questions.
Yeah, so we have one in the chat from kind of Steve's presentation talking about what if a firm is producing food for another location under the same ownership, but is crossing county lines or even state lines. And so IDPH does not, we would generally consider that retail, and we would not inspect a firm that is selling or distributing, or not selling, distributing like kind of within its own, regardless of if it's crossing county lines or even state lines. So crossing state lines, FDA could become involved, but generally to require registration, FDA requires registration for firms that are not considered retail. So generally they have like a definition that says, kind of like Steve was talking about earlier, if a certain percentage, if over 50% of your sales are wholesale, then you would need to register with FDA. But no, it doesn't matter if it kind of crosses county lines or state lines. We just generally look at, is it retail or wholesale? Next kind of question is CBD oil still considered an adulterant if being infused with food? So CBD is not an approved food additive. It's not generally recognized as safe or anything like that. So it's still considered an unapproved food additive. So if we do have a wholesale operation that's not registered with us and there's a complaint, then we will investigate. Steve, do you want to talk about if facilities use kind of special processes? Do we review HACCP plans?
So yeah, if they are being regulated under wholesale and they follow under the seafood HACCP rules or juice HACCP rules, we would look at their HACCP plans, and if there are deficiencies noted, we would expect them to correct those and provide us, evidence of those corrections. I don't know if Sander wants anything to add. Sander's actually seafood HACCP inspector, so he's probably better equipped to answer that question as far as what he would do in that situation. But yes, we generally review their food safety plan. We review any HACCP documents they've created, and we are looking at what kind of deficiencies that we can find. And, we're trying to educate them, and we're on site to correct those issues.
Yeah, I would agree with Steve. He basically covered it very well. Yeah, we're trying to work with the firms. We're not, and get them back on par with the regulation. Usually depending on the what needs to be fixed as far as the particular critical control point, if that's an issue with a critical limit or exceeding a limit numerous times, and there's lots of corrective actions and they need to change the whole process. For instance, that's an example. We have to take that into account, and how long it might take them to totally revise their process. It might involve getting new equipment, standardizing the equipment, establishing new limits, and a whole new SOP. So yeah, we have to take that into account, and how we, what kind of time factor we allow in terms of correction before I go back and do a reinspection or follow-up. Did we have any other questions, Dara?
I don't see any questions currently.
This is Lainey. If you have questions, feel free to unmute or type them in the chat box. We'll leave it open for another couple seconds. I want to thank the IDPH staff for their presentation today. See, Sander, if you want to stop sharing your screen, we can pull up the next presenter's information. I don't see any other questions. So we will take a quick 2-minute break, and we'll be back here at 2 o'clock with our next session, which is Grade A Dairy and Why It Matters. So thank you, Dara, Sander, and Eric. Okay, we will go ahead and get started. Before this next session, just another housekeeping reminder that if your username is not your first and last name, please either share that in the chat box or change your username on your Zoom account, just so that we have record of your attendance for continuing education. I will go ahead and turn the presentation over to Guy for our 2 o'clock session.
Good afternoon, everybody. Guy Sprouse with the Illinois Department of Public Health, and I am the Dairy Program Manager for Illinois. And I was asked to give just a brief presentation today on the dairy program at IDPH, what we do, why it's important to the state, to the public at large, and try to keep this a simple overview without getting too technical. But if you have questions when we're done, please feel free to ask. Let me see if I can get it started. There. I've got my presentation up. So I've titled it, Why Does Grade A Matter? Well, it's got a lot of reasons. And think about how ubiquitous milk is in the American diet of children growing up. We have it as a general nutrition source. We then have it as cereal. We cook with it. We drink it. It's promoted for health and fitness. It's all around a good thing, but it also has its downfalls or risks that come associated. So what is grade A dairy and what makes it special? Easiest way to explain grade A, it encompasses all of the fluid milk products, things such as sour cream, yogurt, kefir, cottage cheese, buttermilk, to name a few things. If you notice up there, it doesn't include things like ice cream, cheeses, hard cheeses, a lot of frozen desserts. Also, things that have dairy as an ingredient, but are not fully dairy. It's very broad, but the things that are grade A, the significance of them is they are extremely perishable, and they have to be maintained and properly handled from the very beginning to the end to make sure they retain their freshness and expectations. Dairy is a complete source of nutrition. If you think about it, mammals start off in life feeding off of milk provided by their mothers. It's a complete source. Ironically, it is such a good nutrition source that there's only one thing in nature better at growing microbial organisms, and that's blood. When you go to the grocery store, consumers have confidence that when they grab that bottle off the shelf or that package, that they are buying a product that is safe for their family, that they don't have to worry about how is this handled, will it make somebody ill, other such things. In grade A, we have a different standard for the quality of the milk used to make these products. We have 2 types of farms in Illinois. We have grade A and we have manufactured. Manufactured is the lower tier, lower standards clear across, including microbial content. Grade A is much higher. And another perk, this creates uniform product standards and regulations across all of the US, the territories, and importing countries. So there really is no state favoritism of this state's easier to work with or that one. The rules are consistent and uniform. And as I mentioned, the public health significance, it's the perfect media for growing bacteria. This product is incredibly susceptible to temperature abuse. And then we jump into the large scale commingling of the dairy from the different farms being picked up, amplifying the risk potential in a plant. Take for example, a lot of folks say my cows are healthy. Out of 100 cows, it only takes 1 cow with salmonella or E. coli or some other type of pathogen being excreted or poor milking practices to contaminate all milk that went into that truck that picks it up, and then all the milk that it's mixed with at the plant. So we have to be very aware of this type of thing going on. And a little bit more fun stuff regarding the risk. Prior to pasteurization, raw milk had been associated and known to transmit the following. It was a primary carrier of tuberculosis 100 years ago. It's been known to cause brucellosis, Q fever, diphtheria, typhoid fever, streptococci infection, salmonella, campylobacter, staphylococcus, and I forgot to type in here all of the E. coli variants. The nice thing is, if we pasteurize it, not a single one of these items is going to survive. And another little bit of trivia, around 1924, pasteurization started becoming widespread in the US. Within a matter of years, this country saw over a 25% drop in foodborne illness-related incidents. This was a huge factor in public health and public safety. And if you recall, there was a lot of this discussion when you were studying to take the LEHP exam, and it does have a historical place. But these are just a few of the diseases. Basically, milk will grow just about anything that gets in it. Some more trivia. Back around the 1930s, we had problems with metropolitan areas and some states placing restrictions on who could sell milk in their communities. This stifled competition, access to market, it drove up cost and limited supplies to the consumers. It was a real issue. And since this is Illinois, I'm going to pick on ourselves. This was a really big problem in the Chicago metropolitan area and down by St. Louis. Northern Illinois didn't want milk coming in from Wisconsin or Indiana and things out of their control. Our farmers in Illinois, if they wanted to sell milk in St. Louis County, they had to be under the inspection and authority of the county. And it just created a mishmash of rules, complications, confusion. So in 1950, we had the first National Conference on Interstate Milk Shipments. And the purpose was, it was to create a uniform standard and process across the country. And this document has become known as the Pasteurized Milk Ordinance. Basically, some would tell you that it's the Bible of dairy. It's currently 450 pages. At our national conference earlier this month, it gained probably another 60. And there's over 2,000 pages of supporting documents to explain what the PMO is. So it's kind of a logistics nightmare to even figure out this program. But what was unique was back in 1950, this was the first program of its kind between the FDA, all of the states and territories interested, and the dairy industry, from the farmer all the way up to the final bottling, processing, the big companies. In our framework, every person can submit rule changes or propose new rules every 2 years at our national conference. These same people can serve on committees, the councils, the executive board. Everybody can have a role in it. It gets a little limited that there's politics, that anybody can stop a proposal or change it, but ultimately only the states get to vote on approval or rejection of it. If we approve something, the FDA can either concur or object. If they object, it can't be a simple, we don't like it. It has to be scientifically based and valid, or it becomes a matter of rule for our program. Okay, so what is the result? Or sorry, this resulted in probably the most regulated commodity in North America. The amount of regulation is ridiculous and very burdensome, starting on the farm and ending when it gets to the grocery store. But some of the things that the staff here at IDPH inspects regularly, they have to do the dairy farms twice a year. All people that handle and haul milk to the plants from the farm every 2 years. They have to inspect and license the trucks used to transport every 2 years. People at the plants that collect samples for quality control and antibiotic testing. The lab at the plant that tests the antibiotics has to be inspected and licensed. The entire plant gets 3 full inspections a year that could take anywhere from 1 to 3 or 4 days. If they form milk jugs on the property, that facility also becomes part of the inspection and gets inspected routinely. Each pasteurizer in the plant is tested every 3 months and sealed to make sure they cannot produce or alter anything that would affect public health safety parameters. We collect samples of products monthly from each producer to make sure that they meet bacteriological standards and quality based on the most basic of standards. And we also have to do evaluations of all single service suppliers in Illinois that participate in the dairy program. And something a little unique is that all packaging in the grade A dairy program has to come from an approved single service supplier. And there's a national and international list of people that receive a yearly audit and monthly sampling, doing monthly sampling and testing to prove that the products are safe. If they do not use from these sources, the plant can automatically fail under the right circumstances. So, what do we inspect on a dairy farm? First thing, general sanitation and construction of all equipment that contacts milk. This one's about as straightforward as it sounds. It's not much different than a retail or a foods manufacturing inspection. You're looking for the construction. Are they using the approved materials of stainless steel, food grade plastics, rubbers, inert materials? Are the welds good? Are there any dents, creases, cracks? Do we have proper coving so that there's no square corners and everything is cleanable? We are examining that in scrutiny. And when we look at cleanliness, it's a little bit of a different standard also. Before I began in this program, I looked at equipment in restaurants and other places and it looks clean. And hey, there's a sanitizer. If you have ever seen that nice, pretty rainbowish blue hue on some stainless steel in a place, I'll let you in on a secret. It's not clean. That is a protein residue causing that refraction. It's not clean by our standards, and that would be debited as a cleaning violation. And to take things a step further in grade A dairy, if it's not clean, it automatically gets a sanitizing debit. You cannot sanitize something that's not clean. You can sterilize dirt, but you cannot clean dirt. Or you can sterilize it, but you can't sanitize it. Another thing, we look at the cleanliness of the cows and their housing areas. We want to make sure that these cows have the hair around their teats and tails trimmed short so that it's not attracting manure balls or any type of particulate matter. We're also looking at just the general condition of them, the flanks, everything, because the honest goodness truth is milking can be a little bit of a dirty practice as far as what we're used to, but this is raw agriculture still, and we process to make it safe. Cooling practices, just like in retail, you keep hot, hot or cold, cold. Here, we are looking at how fast can they achieve cooling of that milk when it leaves the cow. At first, it leaves at about 103 degrees Fahrenheit, gets piped through stainless steel into what's called a bulk tank, or possibly even onto a over-the-road tanker. But when they first pump it into a bulk tank, they have 4 hours to get that milk down from 103 to 45 degrees or less. Then any milking they do subsequent to that, they have 1 hour that they can rise slightly above 45, but they have to get it back down within that hour. And so we take this pretty serious. And in fact, since 2000, any new bulk tank on a farm is designed and comes with a recording thermometer that keeps a permanent record of the date, time, cooling practices. It can also indicate to us when the tank was emptied, if it was properly cleaned or not before milk went back into it. If it's a larger farm and they're going to go directly onto a semi-tanker, you use something called a glycol chiller, and it's an amazing piece of technology, but it also is incredibly expensive, anywhere from 100,000 to a couple million. But it'll take milk from 103 to 36 degrees in under 1 minute. It doesn't give it enough time for bacteria growth to occur. Other items we look at, proper drug labeling and segregation and storage. We have to ensure that they're not using any prohibited substances. A lot of veterinarians prefer to work on not large animals. I'm trying to think of the proper term for our pets, small animals. But dairy's a little unique. A lot of vets, if they work with some meat, they know about meat withdrawal, but dairy has a different withdrawal practice and has to be properly documented on all prescriptions and approved. We're trying to prevent people from having illegal substances. And there's numerous things that you can buy at a local farm supply store, things like DMSO, nitrofurazone. Then we can get into all kinds of fun, exotic antibiotics and things that aren't even like chlorphenicol, that's not even legal in the US any longer. So we've got to make sure they're using only approved stuff, that they're using the approved things correctly, and that they are withholding milk from that animal until all drug residues have cleared. And we'll talk about that in a minute. We also look at pest control methods, and in particular, flies and rodents can be a big issue on a dairy farm. And we look at all the chemicals used for cleaning, sanitizing, drenches used for pest control, sprays, herbicides. We'll also look at protection of the water sources from well to the end use, looking for any potential for cross connections, submerged inlets, high pressure pumps used for power washing, farm equipment, and the milking room. And we'll pay attention to teat preparation and milking practices. How well are they cleaning that before they start milking? Are they doing the pre-sanitizer afterwards? Are they doing a post-dip? We're going to scrutinize all of these items. Just for a view of a few farms, the most primitive way we don't do anymore, except for in a few rare circumstances, and that was hand milking, where you sit on a stool next to the cow, you reach under with two hands and you squeeze and pull into an open bucket where chaff, dust, flies, all kinds of fun stuff gets into. 80 years ago or so, we switched to the bucket milker, which is a very primitive type of automatic milking device in the upper left corner. Around the 1940s, we started developing milking parlors, which is seen in the top center photo. This one's not efficient, but it was the start of a new era in dairy. And this allowed them to milk multiple cows in one area using shared equipment. And then the cows leave and everything in that room can be wet cleaned, sanitized, put away and stored until the next. So it provides a very clean sanitary environment. Top right side, you see what looks like a modern milking parlor. Not much different than the one a few miles from my house that milks 3,200 cows a day. This is designed for efficiency and moving a large number. But if you really want to milk a lot of cows, you go down to the bottom left-hand side, and there is a rotary parlor with over 120 cows on that platform. It takes roughly 14 minutes for two people to milk 120 on a unit like this. The cow steps on, gets things cleaned up, the equipment put on, and she goes for a nice little comfortable ride for a bit. In fact, systems like this are used on many of the farms out west, such as Tillamook in Oregon has one farm with over 70,000 cows, and they use about 10 of these units. Then on the bottom right, the newest thing, the automatic milking unit or robot. And this is a fully automated system that does all of the work on the cow and the milking, even self-cleans itself. Downside is it's a lot of money. It's got a lot of parts, a lot of sensors, a lot of things that break. And if something goes wrong, you have to have the cash on hand and be able to have it fixed within 12 hours. A unique thing about a cow is when she is lactating, she has to be milked every 12 to 24 hours to keep production volumes at where they are. After 12 hours, her body experiences negative inhibition and it starts telling her, you don't need to feed the calf so much. you don't need to make as much milk. And so she starts producing less. And it goes. So it starts a dangerous cascade. But these are just what some of the places look like. So we've got milk on the farm. And we're ready. It's in the tank. It's cold. But we've got to go on to the next person. And here we've got the bulk milk hauler samplers and the milk tank trucks. Both are licensed and inspected. And they serve a valuable function. They transport the milk from the farm to the plant, but they also collect regulatory samples, farm samples for traceback purposes. They're also measuring the volume and weight of milk in that tank, which the farmer's getting paid for. So a milk sampler hauler has to be a person of integrity and trustworthy. They could stick their finger in a sample vial and alter the price you're getting paid because of bacteria contamination. They can short your stick and you get paid less. There's various things. Also, the tanks used, when they deliver, they get washed, sanitized, and inspected. The inside of the tank, the seals, the pumps, the hoses, all equipment. And once it is sealed or it's approved as being cleaned and inspected, all outer openings are sealed up and they get tamper evident numbered seals for security purposes. This goes back to one, biosecurity, as without the seals, somebody could open the top hatch or do something that could contaminate the product inside or use a chemical, some type of adulterant. So it's security for everybody's peace of mind. And it also gets a tag identifying where the truck was washed, when, the time, and the chemicals used on it. And that will be required to be held by the next person they deliver to as proof that that tank was clean and safe. And the reason we have to do that is, gosh, trying to think how far back, I'm thinking it's close to 30 years ago, Schwan Foods had a big salmonella outbreak involving their ice cream nationwide. And what ended up happening was they were buying pre-pasteurized ice cream mixed by the tanker, freezing it off at their plants and putting it in tubs, but they did not repasteurize anything. The truck they consigned to deliver this to them had picked up liquid egg product and was not properly cleaned, contaminated by the liquid egg, and ultimately it contaminated all of the ice cream mix that went into the tanker. So this kind of became another added protection layer to make sure that we can ensure the safety. Now, we've got it in the truck. The truck pulls up to a receiving bay. They want to pump out that milk and get home, but it's not that easy. First thing they're going to have to do is an inspected and evaluated employee will open the tanker hatch from the top. He's going to look in, he or she is going to look inside of it. They're going to look for abnormalities such as off color indicating the presence of blood, stringiness. Is there any off odors? Any visible filth or floating debris, butterballs, ice formation. All of these could be reasons for rejection right off the bat. And then he's going to take a sample or a test using a certified thermometer to verify that the product meets our temperature standards. If the temperature standard is not met, the milk is automatically rejected and has no market for it to go to at this point. If those are all good, they use a sanitized dipper and using good practices so they don't contaminate anything. They take a universal sample of the product, and this is going to go to their lab that's inspected and certified to test for antibiotics, or what we call inhibitors, which is even broader than the basic term antibiotics. If a residue is detected above a threshold, all milk in that tank will be dumped and documented for disposal. It's a gray area because it's not an absolute zero. Our testing is incredibly sensitive, and it can find the most minute traces even below what could potentially cause anaphylaxis in a person or issues. But we have a threshold that says at this point it is contaminated. To give you an idea of the sensitivity, in a milk tank truck, that semi-trailer will hold 60,000 pounds of fluid milk. We can find 1 drop of penicillin G in it. So we have to be a little bit discriminatory in where we set the limits with an absolute zero. Ironically, if the milk is found to be positive for one of these substances, it's going to be dumped. But the milk hauler collected 1 sample from every single farm. And now we're going to test every single farm who had milk on that single truck. And we're going to find out who did it. Downside is the person who did it is going to pay everybody else for their lost product that day. So this could be very expensive. Right now, a tanker is about, I want to say, $25,000. So it's a pretty big hit on the pocket, and maybe your farm insurance will cover it, maybe not. If a farmer has a second incident like that in the same year, then a monetary fine gets imposed, and it's $4 for every 100 pounds of milk they ship during 3 consecutive days. And depending on the size of your farm, we could be into $100,000 if you're large enough. So we take this very seriously, but since strict antibiotic testing began about 25 years ago, it went from being probably 1 out of every 50 tankers being dumped to maybe 1 in 1,000. We only see this in Illinois 2 or 3 times a year. Additionally, 1 day a month that we will tell them when to, they will take that sample that they took from the farm, and if it was all good on the tanker, that gets sent to a central lab, and the farm gets its milk tested for antibiotics again, temperature, total plate count, and something we call somatics. And the somatic cell is basically a white blood cell in a cow, or the equivalent, and it's a sign that there's infection going on and something's not right. And so we can use these to help narrow down, and the farm co-ops can. Is there problems with sanitation? Are there practice problems with the animal husbandry or health? All things that we can look at and we learn. Next, if the milk is found free of inhibitors, and it does meet the requirements for the temperature also, it gets pumped into the plant through sanitary hoses and into steel pipelines. All of this becomes CIP-able. It's cleaned in place by recirculating water. We rarely in dairy get to use brushes anymore and hand clean stuff. It's all automated using very caustic and acidic chemicals and data recorders for the alkalinity, pH, temperature, flow rates of the solutions. But it's going to go in there. So now we have the milk in the plant. What do we do with it next? Well, first of all of our dairy plants in this state at least are designed in a manner such that raw milk cannot get beyond receiving and the raw storage area without going through the pasteurizer. There's no way to flip a valve or move a switch or anything else and take raw milk and send it to a bottle filler or a cheese vat or something else. This is designed out of the system from the get-go as a safety factor. It has to go through to connect to anything else. I don't know if people remember, but back in 1985, we had an incident in Illinois called Hill Farm Dairy up in the north. And in a short period of time, we had over 16,000 confirmed cases of positive salmonella. and up to 25,000 people included that were not legally diagnosed and included in the report. That was the largest dairy outbreak in the US and one of the largest processing outbreaks in history. Really a bad slap in the face to our state and our image. But we learned from it, and design control becomes a great way in helping ensure that we're safe. So we've got the design. Pasteurization, you hear all about it. It's defined as the process of heating every particle of milk at the proper temperature for required time using properly designed and operated questions. I often would get phone calls, questions about people in retail and small business wanting to do dairy. And they tell me they can heat up something in a pressure cooker or a stock pot and reach the temperatures. But the definition requires time, properly designed and operated equipment. My work world isn't as simple as a kitchen. And I do want to stress to people, and this really can be a sore point to consumers, and I'm sure even to some of you on this conference today, pasteurization is not sterilization. Those are different terms. In pasteurization, all pathogens of concern are destroyed. There is nothing left that is going to make you ill. But some spoilage bacteria and other bacteria can still remain, such as some of the lactic acid formers. And this is where you're not going to like me. Spoilage is a quality issue. It's not technically a public health concern. I know, you open a gallon of milk or a carton, you take a swig, it's spoiled, you vomit. Well, that's more of a body reflex from the smell or the taste. It's not truly a foodborne illness, and nobody likes to hear that from me. Then pasteurization, you're not getting a quiz on this. You don't have to know anything about it like the LEHP exam, but that pasteurization is the easiest, cheapest pasteurization process that you can do. And I'll show you an example of it. It only requires 145 degrees Fahrenheit, but it has to be maintained for 30 minutes under strict conditions, which when we get to it, a stock pot won't work. Next up is the high temp short time pasteurizer. This is the most common unit. Cheap one will start at about 75,000. Really nice one, probably 5 to 10 million. But however, it can do quite large volumes of milk in a very short time with options included. So it's 161 degrees for only 15 seconds. If you've got more money and you want to go down a different route, we can do a high heat short time pasteurizer that requires a minimum temperature of 212 for 1/100th of a second. And that gives us extended shelf life, which knocks out a lot of the spoilage. Or we can go ultra high temp, which is aseptic pasteurization at 280 degrees for 2 seconds. All of these will provide a lethal kill to all pathogens. They just have different cost factors, parameters of operation, expense to maintain, and applications. But I'll hit on each of them briefly. The first one, this picture is just a typical vat pasteurizer. It's nothing fancy. It looks like a steam jacketed kettle, but we can control the temperature of the water very carefully, raising it up so that it doesn't scorch. We can also then remove the hot water or steam and replace it with coolant to cool the product when it's finished. In order to ensure that every single particle is exposed at the proper temperature, you'll notice that you've got an agitator in the center, but then off to the side is a wave breaker to stop that circular motion and truly distribute and expose all of the milk to equal and even temperatures. The top of it during operation is going to be covered. The agitator is going to have double boots on it to make sure that if any hydraulic or transmission fluid comes from the agitator's motor and starts leaking, it cannot get on there. If any water, anything else lands on this lid, it all drips away. Every opening is sealed to the environment. And down below at the bottom on the right side, you'll see that there's an outlet valve. It looks simple. And it just looks like a simple gate valve that you pull back and forth to let stuff in and out. But actually, it's a solid piece of billet stainless steel, and it's designed so that when it closes, every drop of milk that could have been trapped inside of it drains out onto the floor, so that nothing is left that will not be pasteurized later when that becomes open. Also, in the lid at the top, the photos don't show it, but oftentimes there's also some type of a heating element or steam injection, because the milk likes to foam when it gets inside of these vessels. The foam comes up, it traps all of the air particles, it insulates itself. So added heating has to be applied to the top to make sure that every particle gets it. So it's not as simple as it seems, but this is the simple one. Downside is they take forever to fill. They take just as long to pump out. And they take an hour, 2 hours or more to get up to temperature, and just as long to cool back down. So they're good for small batches of things, but not for a larger business. And that leads us to the next type, and this is the high temp short time pasteurizer. And this is pretty typical of one. It looks horrible right now, I know, and it did to me for years, but I can look at one of these now and figure it out without too much trouble. But you'll see there's a lot of complexity to it. We're starting to add more tubes, pipes, all kinds of things that don't have to make sense at this point. There's a whole control panel of things being recorded and documented of the process along each step of the way, so that we know total control. What was the temperature at any given time of the product during pasteurization, during cooling? Was the product in forward flow, which means it's legally pasteurized and could leave, or is it in diverted flow, which means it wasn't, so it gets recycled back and repasteurized until we do. But the complexity adds. And as we step up, it keeps adding up. This is an example of a typical high heat short time pasteurizer. The next step up, typically we only needed that lower temperature of, what was it, 212 for a hundredth of a second. There's a problem with getting milk to 212 degrees. The problem is we've already hit the boiling point of water. Milk has sugars, proteins in it. So under the Molal rule, its boiling point is going to be even lower than that. And actually, once we get milk above about 190, it starts scorching. So we get systems like this, which are really kind of neat. It will take, this is for extended shelf life, which instead of having a 10 to 14 day product shelf or code, this might have 2 months on it. Often you'll see it on whipping cream, half and half, things that people will buy but not use quickly. It's kind of a neat system. It's very similar to the high temp pasteurizer, but it has to add another step. And the only way we can get milk up to those type of temperatures is we inject dry steam, dry culinary steam into the milk after it's heated up to about 180 or 190. And we use this to shoot the temperature up even higher. Downside is the danger that comes with getting steam up to 240 or 300 degrees Fahrenheit requires immense amounts of pressure to shoot it. So things have to be built bulletproof and ready for that kind of explosion to happen. So we can use the water or the steam, and under those conditions, we can get the temperature to shoot up real fast. That's nice, but we added water to the milk now. So under federal law, to keep from calling this adulterated by adding water, there's a big vacuum chamber on the left side of this photo. And that is used to flash and pull off some of the water that was just added. But we're only pulling off enough to get back to where we started. And in the process, by pulling the vacuum and that steam, the milk will drop 50 or 80 degrees instantly. So it has a cooling effect also. Then we can finish cooling it. Something like this, you're typically going to be looking at 25 million or more. Then we get to the granddaddy, the ultra high temp pasteurizers, or the fully aseptic units. These are similar to the high temp short time in that it has to have steam injection, it has to pull vacuums, and be able to pull this out. In this model, they've thrown in a separator to split the cream and the milk into different streams and then combine it back into 1, 2, 3% milk. It also has a homogenizer hooked up to it. These are great. I mean, this is shelf-stable milk, not popular in the US, but very common throughout most of Europe, Latin America, Africa, other places, because it doesn't need refrigeration. It's a beast to use. It requires full sterilization before it can process anything, and full sterilization will take 2 to 4 hours. Every pipe, every storage vessel, every valve will be opened and closed and exposed to sterilizing steam until the process is completed. If there's a technical glitch during processing of the product, the system shuts down, automatically dumps everything on the floor in front of it where it is through all of the valves, and it goes back into a cleaning and resanitizing cycle, and you're going to wait another 2 or 4 hours before you can start up. So that's just a little bit. I didn't want to get too technical into the equipment, which kind of I find fascinating. Just giving you an overview. These pasteurizers, I hate to say it, but in some ways, this is even more important than the routine inspections and the other things that we do. During COVID, pasteurizer-related emergencies for broken seals and testing requirements was the one thing food, drugs, and devices, or food, dairies, and devices continue to do as a necessary public health function. So on this routine testing, we'll make any minor adjustments. You know, if the thermometer's off a degree or this or that, we can tweak it. If they have any major problems, the system will not be operated until everything is fixed and corrected. And depending on what went wrong, there could be a recall of all products since the last time it was tested. Anything that could affect or control public health, time accuracy, temperature accuracy, pressure differentials, when different pumps start and stop, operating conditions, computer programming language to control certain functions. Every one of these things is put under what we refer to as a regulatory seal. It's a wire seal with a lock on it or an embossed weight that has our logo and information. And it's placed on things in such a way that nothing can be changed. Usually it's on covers of controls and stuff, but the only way you can make the machine run faster, lower temperature, do things is to cut one of these off to access the programming underneath. So those are something that is a really big deal to us. And we ask plants in their morning checklist that they always do an inventory of all seals in the plant. I can think of one plant with 4 different pasteurizers, and there's probably 40 seals in there. But it's to their benefit to go through every day and make sure that each one of them is in place where they are. If it falls off or you accidentally break it touching something, let your supervisor know. They contact IDPH. Our inspector gets out there, works with them, we get things going. But if we show up and find that the seal is missing, the penalty can be a total recall of all product going back to the last time the pasteurizer was tested, or the inspector noted that they saw and confirmed that the seals were present during a plant inspection. So this is really one of our really big things, and we work hard at. The major tests, just to give some kind of reference, we check accuracy of all thermometers, the indicating and the recording thermometers that are the legal thermometer and basically the document of what you say you're doing. We have to check the accuracy on the time of the charts. For instance, we can't have a chart that says we've been running for an hour and it's actually been 54 minutes. That would indicate something's not going right in the system, possibly. So we have to look at those. We look at movement through the flow diversion valves and their timing. This is a unique public health redundancy in dairy where we use 2 3-way valves to separate the pasteurizer from downstream. This way, if one valve leaks, it kind of reverts back and goes back to the starting point of the whole system. So we have lots of redundancies. We have to measure the speed of milk as it flows through the holding tube to ensure the time and temperature is met, that all public health fail-safes are operating as designed. The whole pasteurizer is designed that if there's a power failure, everything dumps. If a pump fails or a valve sticks, things dump. Nothing leaves unless all requirements are met. We also have to make sure that proper pressure differentials are maintained, because with these faster pasteurizers, we're using what is called a thin-walled heat exchanger. Kind of looks like a radiator, but it's not. It's actually plates with about a 1/16 of an inch gap between the centers of them, back to back, over and over, with either steam and raw milk running through it, pasteurized milk against cold milk, or we pre-warm raw milk against pasteurized milk. But because of the thinness of this and metal deteriorates over time, you have the potential for leakage to go through the plates with cracks and small fissures. So we can work with this by maintaining pressure and keeping more pressure on the pasteurized side. So we're getting into some of the technical nerdy stuff. Trying to think if I'm missing anything important on this one. I think those are the highlights. So you got it pasteurized. What can you do with it now? The fluid milk can be transported. Well, it will be transported by stainless steel pipeline to potentially bottle and fillers and carton formers. It could be sent to a culture tank for fermentations, sent to open cheese vats for making different types of cheeses, or it could even go to a condensing operation via microfiltration. It could be spray dried, drum dried. It could be broken down for crystallization of components such as lactose and whey crystals. We have lots of options, but before anything can be done, it has to be pasteurized first. Here, I wanted to give people a view of what a plant looks like that is making yogurt. I can remember being at the local health department, seeing a restaurant that back at the time, I kind of accepted, and I shouldn't admit it, but they would make yogurt overnight in their oven, pour some milk in a pan, put it in the oven overnight with a spoonful of yogurt they had on hand, let the pilot light incubate it. I can tell you now that they were lucky they never had problems, even though I had done it as a kid at home, making yogurt. But this is how we do it now. The vessels are all stainless steel, properly designed for cleanability, slopage, drainage, and access. They are fully cleaned, sanitized, and then sealed. The milk is pumped into them, and then somebody climbs on top and through a small opening with a cover on it, less than 3 inches wide, they pour a vial of lab cultured freeze-dried bacteria into it. In dairy processing, freeze-dried culture is the way to go. The labs can ensure sterility and that there's continuation of the quality and contents of the bacteria cultures that are being used or chosen for specific characteristics. If you were to start with a regular yogurt and just adding a spoon from the old batch, which they once used to do, you get these beautiful little creatures called bacteriophages in it. They're really neat in how they can clip genetic information from one organism to another and insert it someplace it shouldn't be. And it changes the milk cultures. The best example of a bacteriophage ever was when it clipped the Shigella toxin gene, or the Shiga toxin from Shigella, and inserted it in benign E. coli. They have benefits, but they can have dangers. Here, we are able to control the process and prevent contamination of anything entering it that's not intended. Next picture. This one is going to frighten you, I think. or might from most people's perspective, these are open cheese vats. Basically, we never see milk in a dairy plant other than after it goes in the bottle or when they open the hatch in receiving to take the first sample for quality testing. It's always an enclosed, protected system. Here, though, cheese making gets a little bit complicated because you have to have cheese knives, you have to agitate it, cut the curd, drain it, do other things. Putting lids on it just is not a practical alternative. But what we do is we use process controls. And a room like this is designed from the get-go to be fully washable, floors, walls, ceilings, every item in it, sanitized in place. They have HEPA filtration for the incoming air and large volumes of it to help remove the steam and humidity. They tend to be air conditioned because if you don't, the humidity is going to collect on the cold pipelines overhead or anything else. And then we have drips and risk of that, which would be a great place for listeria bacteria in a plant. So we've got those. When you enter and exit this room, you're going to go through boot scrubbers to make sure that your feet are not going to track anything in by chance. The employees are trained in very strict hygienic practices about you don't touch the product, you wear your hair net, beard nets, the whites assigned to you, etc. And then a few more fun little jollies. In this cheese room, there are drop-down hoses all over the place with sanitizer that comes from a central system that's tested daily and verified by titration, so that they have access to it if needed. And any water in that room that is used for spraying, rinsing, any other purpose is chlorinated to 100 parts per million or acidified to a point that it is considered safe. And so we add in extra precautions. The final testing is going to really come down to it. I do want to throw this one out. Probably one of my favorite things I have to preach to everybody. Culturing is performed under highly controlled conditions to selectively grow desirable bacteria and prevent unwanted bacteria and mold from contaminating. And I'm going to sum it up right here. This is intentional temperature abuse, and it needs to be done correctly to be done safely. So when we start talking about cheese and cultured products and things in retail, maybe you're starting to see why I really kind of cringe and it gives me the heebies. But think about it. Where else in your professional career have you seen intentional temperature abuse in food? Okay, so we've gotten the milk from the farm, it's through the plant, it's pasteurized, maybe further processing's gone on. At this point, we can package it for distribution and onto the warehouse. But typically, that milk is bottled in the plant and on a store shelf within 24 hours of delivery. So going back to one of those first slides, when I talked about widespread distribution and commingling and all the other facts, this is a tough product because it goes out so fast, gets ripped off the shelves, and people consume it in a very short time. Often before the first illness is known or reported, everything is gone and can't be recovered from the store shelves. So diligence from the get-go is the greatest salvation. Just wanted to show a few trivia pictures. This is a typical carton former. If you ever wondered how they make that school lunch milk, we start on the right side with just cardboard stock. It goes through, you'll see a little wheel where it kind of forms it into a square or seals parts of it. In the center, milk is put into the cartons and exactly proportioned. Down the far end, left end, the carton gets sealed up, date and time stamped and coded, and then it's sent on a conveyor into the cooler. I do want to point out this unit because some of you have probably had headaches or an experience involving it you didn't realize once in your life. A common complaint that I don't like to hear or receive because it's preventable is a child opening a school lunch milk at school and smelling chemical in it. And I can tell you what happened is, being that this is a clean in place system, automatically sanitizing residue is left behind. Liquid sanitizer is standing in the filler bowl. And as the first few cartons get filled, they get an extra shot of sanitizer. The carton gets sealed. It's got a very small headspace at the top, so it volatilizes out and concentrates. And even more so with a gallon, a person puts a carton up to their face to drink. So they're getting their nose close to it and they get a whiff of that chemical. It's easily preventable by draining or running pasteurized water through the system just as a final flush. Last but not least, basic gallon filler. It's just kind of an assembly line. The jugs are made in a room adjacent, come through on a conveyor belt, and then they go on this rotating platform that kind of lifts them up as they go, presses the nozzle in for a tight seal, fills it, and then slides over to a capper that spins caps onto the top of it. The whole time, those openings you see have to be completely shielded so that nothing potentially can fall out of the sky. And even this little seals that go at the top of each bottle, you'll see the red rubbery looking part, those have deflectors on them, so that if any foam comes over the top of this unit, it won't get onto the milk jugs and the containers down below. In fact, it'll all flow into the center away from them and spill out. So just some overviews of things we look at. Last but not least, you're at the end. It goes into a large distribution cooler where it may be for the next 12, almost never more than 24 hours. But that's the easy parts in some ways. My staff still has some stuff left to do. As I said, we do lots and lots of inspections. So they have to do that full plant inspection every 3 months. But during it, they have to review every processing record for the last 3 months, looking at records coming off of the pasteurizers, all cooling charts, all cleaning charts, documentation of it. They have to grab a stack of milk receipts and verify that every truckload of milk that arrived at that plant had a sample collected and is on the receiving log and on the inhibitor log in the lab showing that it was tested. If not, that could come back with regulatory repercussions. Then also, we collect monthly samples of every finished product based on categories that the plant produces. We'll take a sample of the raw milk or a few of them, but we also look at the finished products where we're looking to make sure that we can't find with even stronger tests any evidence of antibiotics, that the temperatures were good at the plant. We look for coliforms, which the limit is 10 per mil, or no, 10 per gram. Then we look at the total plate count, which is going to give us an indication of general plant sanitation. And last but not least, we run a test on something called phosphatase, which is an indicator, a biochemical indicator that the product was properly pasteurized. As far as samples go, it's a little complicated to explain how they're determined, but first and foremost, we go off of categories based on standards of identity. If the product has a legal name and definition, such as whole milk, yogurt, sour cream, then we break it down into various fat levels. A person makes plain milk or milk and it's skim 1%, 2%, 3%. We're going to collect one of every fat level. But oh, wait, they make chocolate in 2% and strawberry in 3% and 4 other flavors in whole. We're going to grab one of each of the flavors in, or one flavor for each fat level. And so it gets quite complicated. I've got an inspector down in the Edwardsville area that they go to a plant every month and collect over 35 samples. It's multiple coolers. And it's quite overwhelming, but this becomes the final check and balance in our system. And last bit, And maybe this will help everybody be a better shopper and save $1, but don't tell anybody I said so. Every grade A product sold in the US will have a plant code on it indicating who packaged the product, regardless of the name on the label. It's not uncommon to go into a bottling plant and you know it is this company, but they package milk under 50 to 200 or more names for other people, convenience stores, specialty stores, hotels, coffee shops. But you can take this number and you can go to the interstate milk shippers list and you can look it up and you can find out exactly who made that milk that you're drinking or that dip, cottage cheese. And it's really kind of fun. I go to the grocery store and I see the name brand on this shelf for $4.29 a gallon. And right beside it is the generic brand for $2.50. But then you read the code, they're side by side and they're made at the same plant. Just, it's a little bit of fun. Just know who's making your stuff and you might be surprised at times. Also, for an inspection purpose at retail, Indiana, for instance, I know that they go through and their inspectors, when they'll do a grocery or convenience store, they'll look at some of these numbers and make sure that whoever's milk is on the shelves is actually an approved source to be selling out there in the world. And on this list, you can find out who is approved from any state, and you can also find out what kind of products they're approved to make. They might make 15 things, but can only ship one item in interstate commerce, and you get to know. All right. I have tried to keep this simple as I was asked to, and just kind of like an overview of the dairy program and things that we do and look at. It's a very complex, broad program. And most of the inspectors that work in it like it. They like the technicality of it, the very strict rules and hard lines. And let's face it, sometimes it's fun just to go out and spend the day on farms and seeing all those beautiful cows. Any questions?
If you have questions for Guy, go ahead and type them in the chat box or unmute yourself and you can ask them directly.
And I do apologize for going over. I had it timed at 40 minutes.
Oh, you're fine. I actually don't see any questions in the chat box, Guy, so I will have the IEHA staff forward you any questions we get.
Oh, no, please do. And I didn't think to provide my information for contact, but I'll give you the easy way. All of you know my dear Dara. If you send questions down the road or you need information or something, Dara is very good about keeping me in the loop. And I'll also tell this group that I have been working on something with Dara since last summer. And tonight I'm going to go home and get it finished so she can give you all a surprise tomorrow.
What a way to end it, Guy. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, everybody. Have a nice day.
Thank you. Okay, we will go ahead and move on to our last session of the day, which is freeze drying food safety with Eric from the Indiana Department of Public Health. Eric, are you on? Eric, I don't know if you're speaking. I don't think you're on mute, but I can't hear you. on your Zoom, if you go to your little microphone, you should be able to select your microphone. If you have any attachments or anything into your laptop or your desktop, it may have picked the wrong mic for you.
Check, check. How's
Oh.
that?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Okay, sorry about that.
That's
Sorry
okay.
about that, guys. So we are going to dive into this slideshow from the beginning. So yeah, today we're going to be talking about freeze drying fundamentals and a lot of it in terms of what is the actual fundamental of freeze drying. So we'll look at food freezing, we're going to look at food drying, and then we're going to look at freeze drying and the associated food safety issues that accompany those. So we'll go ahead and just start moving through this. Indiana Department of Health, our mission is to promote, protect, and improve the health and safety of all Hoosiers and really all of our citizens throughout this entire great country of ours. We want every Hoosier to reach their optimal health regardless of where they live, learn, work, or play. So again, in terms of agenda, a real brief introduction of who I am and what my background is. Then we'll look at the freezing, the drying, freeze drying, and how that is a very different science. Then we're going to look at the food safety risks, equipment considerations, some packaging considerations, and then we're going to glance over the IDOH freeze drying guidance document. That's not really in the scope of this session. And then we'll have some Q&A. So, you know, I'm a Boilermaker. So I'm a Purdue food scientist. I studied at Purdue University. And again, I also studied at Swedish University of Ag Sciences. And I've been out in the field for a while with ConAgra and Park 100s and others. And then I've worked on the professional staff at the university for 17 years. I'm back in industry now. I'm with Wix Pies, and I've been really, really involved with a lot of different plants over the years. So I've had a consultancy. I've been involved with Institute Food Technologists on IFT's executive board for a few years, and a lot of different things that are all listed out on that slide. And, you know, it's just been a very rewarding and full, rich experience that I've been fortunate enough to have. I do speak at a lot of different events, things from MAFPA to FPSA to IFT to whatever folks need. I really like to talk about food science and get good information out in front of the people that need it and make sure that there's a strong understanding of what we need to do to protect our citizens here in this country. So let's talk about freezing. Looks like I've got a chat question. Oh, that's a dairy question. Sorry. Food freezing. One thing that we've got to think about is water migration. Doesn't matter what's going on in your food matrix. If you start to freeze your product, you are putting water molecules in motion. It always happens. You're always moving water through your food matrix. Okay. And what is water? Water is this sharp little triangle. It's HOH, H2O. And if you think of it as these little triangles, it's really quite helpful to imagine them stacking up upon each other. If you move your water from a liquid state to a solid state quickly, well, you're going to have smaller, more uniform ice crystals. But if you move it into that solid state slowly, well, there's a lot of time for these jagged points to stack up upon each other and to really jeopardize the integrity of the food product. So we don't want to freeze slowly. We want to avoid what we call sharp freezing. Okay, so it's really, really important that we think about how we freeze the food. Come on. There we go. Tomato. So I took a tomato and I just put it in a regular home freezer. It was -1 Fahrenheit, left it there for 14 hours. And then I set that tomato on a plate for about 10 hours. And at the end of that 10 hours, I was able to pull that whole flask the bottom of that flask is just full of water that came out of that skin of the tomato. So we didn't break the skin, okay? It just exuded out through the pores of the food matrix because that much water was freed up during the sharp freezing. If you look at this side by side, it's really, really helpful to look at the skin of the tomato and see how the one that has been frozen has been tightened up and wrinkled, and it's also gotten much, much darker because of some freeze concentration. And if you look at it cut in half and you see the cell structure and the free water, look at the free water in the one that has been cut and gone through the freeze thaw is very, very different than the free water in the cellular structure of the fresh intact tomato. So we look at these things and we think about, you know, how food freezing contributes to food safety and to food quality in terms of freeze drying. And the short version is we want to freeze completely and we want to freeze quickly. When you think about freezing, or when you think about any phase change, you're going to require some energy. We call this energy the latent heat of transformation, okay? And so when you think about that phase change, there's a different energy requirement for freezing than there is for sublimation, than there is for boiling. These latent heats of transformation are not going to be absolutely uniform. You're going to look at the different systems and the different circumstances, and you're going to look at what are you actually freezing? Are you freezing water? Are you freezing carbon dioxide? What are you freezing? Okay, so the latent heat is a consideration that we have to make sure to consider. When all of the water, I mean all of the water in a food product exists at a crystalline state, you have reached something that's called eutectic point. Okay, now if you have 99.5%, that's just not good enough, guys. You need all of the water in your sample to be in a crystalline state to have a eutectic point. Okay, and when you have a eutectic point in your frozen food, now you have a conductor of energy. You have an excellent, excellent conductor. The ice crystals will move energy through the food matrix, and that is really, really essential for freeze drying to work. So how do you get a eutectic point? It helps to have a large delta T. Delta T is going to be the difference between the temperature, right here, is the difference between the temperature of a food item and that which is freezing or that is heating or cooling it. Okay, so you have a food item and you have something that is heating or that is cooling it, and whatever that difference is, that's your delta T. Here's an example. You take an 8-ounce juice, 40-degree juice, put it in a freezer that's -5. It's going to be 45 degrees of delta T. That's freezing rate A. Okay, now you take your 8 ounces of juice, you put it in a -40 freezer. You have an 80-degree delta T, and that's rate B. But if you were to take your 8 ounces of juice and put it into a nitrogen bath that's at -320, guess what? You got a delta T of 360 Fahrenheit. You're going to have an instantaneous freeze. So freezing rate A is going to be slower than freezing rate B. And B is going to be slower than C, and C is going to be instantaneous. So think about the crystals and the crystal formation. The ice crystal movement in the food matrix does require time. How much time are you allowing for the water migration to happen? Okay, so you want to have very, very short time, very, very little opportunity for movement, have very, very small crystals. Small crystals are going to have a large surface area. Okay, so look at something like the example down here where you have a huge, just gigantic stack of snowballs, okay, versus an iceberg of equal mass. So they got the same amount of ice, but they have very, very different surface areas. Okay, so how far does any particular water molecule have to move to reach the atmosphere. It doesn't have to move very far through the snowball to get to the edge, but if it's in the center of an iceberg, it's got a long haul to get out to the atmosphere. That's what we're dealing with freeze drying. We're dealing with interactions between the atmosphere and the water, okay? So we want to have the smaller snowball type ice crystals, really, really tight, round ice crystals that haven't had a chance to stack up and ruin the food matrix. Most home-based vendors are going to have these freeze dryers that have set points around -40, okay? And they can put in a product that's at 70 Fahrenheit, and your typical delta T is going to be 110, okay? But if you get into industrial freeze dryers, scientific freeze dryers, it's not unusual to see -80, even more. You can have tremendously low set points. And so you get these large delta Ts. And some of that is just to make sure that we hit that eutectic point. We want to make sure that we have hit the eutectic point, that we have frozen everything quickly and frozen everything absolutely completely. Because once you have everything in a crystalline matrix, in a crystal form instead of a liquid form, you're going to be able to achieve the freeze drying. Okay. Now, if you are freeze drying pineapple or raspberries or chicken breasts or whatever you're freeze drying, when you're freeze drying a food product, you will understand what does it require to reach the eutectic point. You're going to learn with the dimensions of your product, with the density of your product, with the thermal transfer rates, how much time and temperature is needed for you to reach your eutectic point. And when you have that information, that is guarded information. That is a trade secret. That is something that is not freely distributed or provided. Okay, so don't be surprised if people are really, really hesitant in talking about eutectic points, especially if you're in a big commercial freeze drying operation. There's a lot of non-disclosure that goes in to getting that type of information. If you wanted to know, for example, how a firm is going to conduct their freeze drying process, it's much more common to see a statement that says, hey, we're going to freeze this to its eutectic standard. That's more common than to see we're going to freeze this for X number of hours at X number of degrees to reach our eutectic point. They're not going to volunteer that unless they must. Okay. So I'm going a little bit quickly here. I want to make sure that I got everything that I wanted to cover because I felt like I missed a slide. This is where I was missing. Okay. Yep. Sorry, I missed that slide earlier, but I went ahead and covered it. So we're going to have a little pause to see if there are any questions about water migration and food freezing and the effect on the food matrix. Specifically, the slower you freeze, the bigger the ice crystals, the more disruption you have to cell membranes, to cellular structure, to the food matrix as a whole. You also are going to have a harder time reaching eutectic point when you have a slow freeze. You want to freeze quickly, keep the water molecule in its original location, don't give it much time to move around, have a great big delta T to facilitate that energy transfer. Okay, the bigger the delta T, the quicker the rate of energy transfer. So you want to have a big delta T, freeze that stuff really, really, really fast. Keep the ice crystals small, get to your eutectic point, and then you can really think about freeze drying. Okay, how you freeze the product matters a lot. If you're looking at sharp freezing, commercial applications are almost only going to be in the meat industry, where you're going to have hanging meat, where you're going to have chilling that's very, very close to the freezing point of the beef, and it's going to slowly take out the rigor, and those crystal migrations are actually going to be tenderizing the meat a little bit, but we don't see that as a requirement in freeze drying. In freeze drying, you want to freeze quickly. You want to get your ice crystals very, very small and don't give them a chance to move through the food matrix. So, Why would a pre-freeze help? Okay, pre-freeze helps extend the life of your equipment, and it helps ensure that you've gotten a jump on the freezing. So I looked at this and it says, would that lower the delta T? Actually, it'd be kind of the opposite. So if you had a frozen product that you went ahead and you said, okay, I'm going to put this, one of the things we used to do with these protein gels, we had to freeze protein gels quite a lot at the Purdue Food Science pilot plant. We'd put those in a -80 before we ever put them into the freeze dryer. When we put them into the -80, we had this huge delta T that would start working on those protein gels and start freezing them. So when we put that into the freeze dryer, we had a target temperature that was going to be in the -20 range, and our set point was -40. Okay, but our pre-freeze had done most of the work. So we only had to do the end of that freezing curve with our scientific freeze dryer. So pre-freezing is really a guarantee to make sure that you put your product into a eutectic state. If we had put a protein gel at 70 Fahrenheit and we put that right into our freeze dryer and we ran it at -40, even for 4 hours as a pre-freeze, we might not reach our eutectic point, and then the whole process would fail. So putting in the pre-freeze is going to take pressure off of the freeze drying system, and it's going to increase the chances that you will get to your eutectic state. Okay, so yeah, it's like an insurance policy, and it extends the life of your freeze dryer. That's a good question. Okay, so we're going to look at food drying. Food drying. So drying of foods is another instance where we're looking at interactions between the atmosphere and the surface of the product. Okay. Drying food is not targeted. When you are freeze drying, when you are sublimating your product, you are targeting HOH, and you are pulling out just HOH. You're pulling out targeted water. But that's not what happens when you're doing traditional drying. You draw out all kinds of molecules along with the water. You can smell the volatile compounds coming out. When I'm coming up to a plant and they're drying apricots or drying mint or whatever they might be drying, you can smell the plant before you even see it. Okay, but that's not going to be the case in a well-operated freeze drying facility because it's a much more targeted process. So what happens with the food drying when you have a traditional dehydrating chamber, you're going to have all kinds of dramatic physical changes that take place. One of the things is going to be case hardening and encapsulation. So water is moving from a liquid state to a vapor state. We're talking about different latent energy requirements. We're talking about a different phase change. We're talking about evaporation instead of sublimation. And to achieve the evaporation, excuse me, we're often going to have some heat applied. Okay, and when you apply the heat to that product, there's going to be thermal degradation. So that heat damage is a real drawback to the end product that you're going to receive in traditional drying. So when you think about dehydrated foods that don't rehydrate, think about jerky or prunes and plums. You ever soak a prune? It doesn't plump up into a plum. It just doesn't happen, right? You ever try and soak raisins to get grapes? Doesn't happen. So you look at that and you say, there are real changes to the product. And one of those changes is going to be something called case hardening. Case hardening is when the cell structure collapses at the surface where the product meets the atmosphere. The cell structure starts to collapse on the surface at the onset of the drying process, and all of those collapsed cell structure are damaged by heat and by interactions with moving crystals. So you can have salts, sugar crystals, you can have complex carbohydrates, you can have all kinds of things that are bumping up against this case and create a barrier that traps the moisture inside that product. Think about the leathery texture of a dried apricot. Okay, same idea. So this is case hardening. and it really impedes the ability to effectively drop your moisture content. So you can get perfectly safe products with traditional drying, and we've been doing it for thousands of years, but it's really, really important to understand that that product is not going to rehydrate well. That product is fundamentally changed. We have changed the physical properties of that product. And in this traditional drying, we are stripping out all kinds of aromatics and volatile compounds and even nutritive compounds. We're stripping out all kinds of things with the water that would otherwise be left intact if we were freeze drying. Okay. So we're talking about gradients. The gradient, this is a term that is two dissimilar conditions that are put up adjacent to each other. And when you have that, they're going to seek to reach an equilibrium. We could look at a pressure gradient, especially in this instance, we'd be talking about vapor pressure, a general moisture gradient. So what's the relative humidity in the air versus the moisture content in the food product? So you're going to have a moisture gradient there. You can have a temperature, salinity, acidity, all kinds of different gradients. And so we're playing on the concept of a gradient. And when we are using those gradients, we are using them to our advantage to seek an equilibrium state. So we want to have a low relative humidity in the dryer, in the air. We want to have, sometimes we want to have some convective currents. When we think about the multiple types of energy that are used to dry products, there's conductive, which is very traditional. This is laying your product on a tray or laying it on a rack and putting it into, an oven, or putting it into, conductive is all your ducks in a row, right? So if you thought of like the most fundamental example is an electric burner, emits heat onto a pan, the pan then emits it into a pancake, duck, 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 it's conductive, all your ducks in a row, that's moving your conductive heat, okay? Convective is when you have the energy of motion, right? You have some energy, you have some movement, you have something that's coursing around, okay? So you have these air currents that are constantly going along the surface of the product, conveyors, movement, convection, same idea. So you have a lot different thermal energy transfer rates when you have convection versus conductive. And so if you can move that energy quicker, if you can remove that moisture quicker, that can help your product quality. But also if you had something like an impingement system where you have the hot air jets that are blowing through and the product is really light, then you get it flying all around and it's not really conducive to some of these products. So you need to have the right tool for the job when you're doing the drying. Home dehydrators, they do have some, or a convective oven and air fryers. So these are small scale dryers that you're going to use. Low temperatures, 150 Fahrenheit, using some forced air. So it's funny, I like this whole concept of making air fryers popular. And it's like, well, we've had air fryers for a long time. We just call them convective ovens, so a convection oven and an air fryer are very, very similar in principle, but still you use the lower temperatures. The air fryers use higher temperatures sometimes, but you're still getting forced air that's moving around and drying out the product. Okay, traditional home ovens, they use conduction and slightly higher temperatures. So like if you were to dry something on a tray, make your own home fruit roll-ups or make your dehydrated whatever you want to make, eat pear slices or apricots or whatever you make in your home oven, you can do that using conduction. Some of the projects I've worked with were solar dryers, where regions in Senegal and other places didn't have reliable sources of electricity. And so what do? We build a greenhouse effect and make a heating chamber that captures the sun and exhaust some moist air out of a solar powered fan. So we have some low level convective currents, but we have a temperature zone that is really conducive to drying. And so when you look at some of the solar dryers that are being developed for commercial use, they're really excellent technology for traditional drying. Larger scale dryers, you have huge dryers like the grain dryers that you see at your local farms, drum dryers that were originally developed to make paper, but we realized in the food industry that, hey, they're using these for drying wood pulp into paper, and we could use that to dry corn mass into corn chips, or into corn flakes, or we could use that to make potato flakes, or we could use that to make all kinds of different things. But drum dryers were not developed for the food industry, but they were claimed by the food industry after they really became mainstream for recycling paper pulps. Spray dryers, tunnel dryers, it goes on and on. There are way too many large scale dryers to list in this presentation here. But the idea is these are all evaporative systems. You're looking at the latent heat of evaporation. You're looking at moving from a liquid to a vapor. You're looking at a non-targeted process that's bringing out all kinds of volatile compounds along with the water. Okay, so you're stripping out a lot in addition to the water. Okay. Now, when you think about drying, one of the most important things to do is prepare the product, increase the surface area. You're interacting with the atmosphere here. So you want to minimize the distance for the water to travel to reach the atmosphere. So you want to have more contact with the atmosphere. And so if you look at these apples, the apples, you know, I went ahead and I cut one into slices, just random slices. And if you have a whole apple, then only the outer skin contacts the atmosphere, as opposed to the cut apple where lots of surfaces contact the atmosphere. Put them both on a rack and put them in an oven that was 275 Fahrenheit for 3 hours. Okay, so prior to the thermal process, you can see in this picture here, you can see this water escaping, just running all over the place. You have a lot of water that's already being released before any kind of drying process. And that's just because, of course, we've opened up the skin. So when you look at this post-process, you have the intact outer skin. It's really created a jacket around that apple, okay? And it has trapped the moisture inside. And that trapped moisture has boiled, and it has destroyed the internal structure of the apple during the heating. And so the moisture simply couldn't escape the product. This is a good example of a leathery, kind of a jacketed, case hardened product. So it's trapped that moisture inside, and the case has really impeded the drying, okay? Now, when you look at the sliced, well, the slices look very, very different, okay? These apples, the thin slices became very, very brittle and dark, and the thicker slices remain slightly flexible and much lighter in color. And so what's the major factor that leads to the difference in the slices? It's going to be your moisture content, right? The thicker slices contain more moisture. The darker slices, the thinner slices, had driven off all of the moisture. So now the thermal energy that was in the system was available to darken the product, to crisp the product, to discolor the starch, okay? And so you think about in those thicker slices, you're still working to vaporize water. You're still working to vaporize that water out of that system. And these thinner slices where all the water's been removed, well, now that energy is being used for something different. And so that's a really important piece to understand, is the proper preparation. You look at this example, it's exactly the same process, okay? Exactly the same conditions, but the results are totally, totally different because of preparation. This matters with freeze drying tremendously. You have to prepare your product to have a maximum interface with the atmosphere, okay? So when you look at no slicing versus a thicker slice versus a thinner slice, the results are immediately tied to the preparation, okay? Of course, they all require different amounts of distance for the water to move, but really when you think about it, it also comes down to energy and time requirements. Okay, if that prep isn't uniform, the energy and the time are not going to be uniform to reach the same level of drying. It does matter quite a lot. Now, I think questions on the drying overview. So we looked at freezing and how we want to freeze things for freeze drying. And we looked at preparation in terms of drying, okay? And so now we're going to look at one process with lots and lots and lots of names. So water sublimation or freeze dehydration or lyophilization or freeze drying. You hear all these terms bantered around. It's all the same thing, guys. This is one process, lots of names. Don't let it confuse you. It's just lots of fancy names for the same thing, okay? But it's not the same as putting a product in the freezer. Some people will say, well, if I put something in the freezer and I leave it long enough, you know, it'll lose weight, it'll shrink, it'll dry. That's true, but that's not exactly freeze drying, guys. Freeze drying requires very specific conditions to be met in terms of pressure and temperature. And we're going to get to that in just a minute. From a food safety standpoint, you got to understand that this does not kill microbes, period. It doesn't kill them. It doesn't kill parasites. Most microbes are going to be completely viable in stasis for decades when they're freeze dried. Okay. A friend of mine, Dr. Lindemann, look, he gave me one of these ampules of bacterial strain just to, hey, yeah, of course, you know, this is a freeze-dried ampule of a bacterial strain that I need for a long-term study. You heard it in the previous presentation, freeze-dried cultures to be preserved for cheese making. All these things are very, very important to understand. The way that we think about freeze drying has got to be that if you have potentially hazardous food going into a freeze dryer, it's going to stay in stasis. And then when conditions are favorable, guess what? It's potentially hazardous again. So this is not a kill step. Don't kid yourself. It's not a kill step, okay? It is a targeted process that removes HOH and leaves much of the other intrinsic value intact, okay? It changes from a solid to a gas without entering a liquid phase. The product structure is protected. Rehydration works really, really well with freeze drying. So make sure you understand the fundamentals. You're gonna have some problems if you're treating a potentially hazardous food as if it's suddenly safe because it's freeze dried, okay? So 4 steps. Properly prepare the product. It's really important. Freeze the product, freeze it fast and freeze it to eutectic. And then you apply a strong vacuum, and we'll get to that in a minute. And then you add the energy that's needed for the phase change. Okay, so preparing the product, again, maximize the surface area, understand what we're doing. We have a freezing chamber. We have this chamber where we're dropping the pressure, where we're looking at, you know, an interface between the surface area of the product and the atmosphere. So we want to maximize the surface area so we have the most efficient transfer. We expose the product to the atmosphere. We do want to think about enzyme inactivation. Sometimes that can be done with blanching or with acids. There are different ways to inactivate enzymes, and those are usually for qualitative, you know, for color values and things like that. But a lot of some operations don't even bother with enzyme inactivation because they can freeze so quickly, so they can instantaneously freeze, and then they go ahead right into the sublimation. So it depends on your preparation how necessary the enzyme inactivation actually is. So it's really going to be similar preparation to other drying methods. Quickly as possible. Eutectic point, I'm going to say it 100 times. I hope you remember the word eutectic tomorrow. I hope you say, oh, eutectic point. Yes, that's what matters in freeze drying. Okay, and it is common to pre-freeze the products because that's your insurance to make sure you got to that eutectic point. So, and we freeze that product. think about a trade meal, think about a stew, think about a blended product, something like that. Which eutectic point do you use? The requirements for a potato aren't the same as the sauce or the beef or whatever else is in there. And so we have to think about that. And we have to think along the terms of the Choi-Oakes equation and say, look, whatever the most difficult thermal transfer rate is, same concept applies. Reach the most difficult eutectic point. Okay. And so we want to make sure we understand the eutectic point of all of the components, and we've reached them for the most difficult component. Another thing is freeze drying. Let's say you've got peaches and they're bruised and they're windfalls and they've got some insect damage, and you say, oh, I'm just going to freeze dry them. Guess what? It's not going to compensate for rot or decay or product flaws. That's not what freeze drying does. It's going to preserve it in that condition, and when it's reconstituted, when it's put back into use, you're still going to have those product flaws, and you're still going to have the associated micro risk. So you've got to be realistic about what you're expecting out of freeze drying. Okay. Applying a strong vacuum. What's a strong vacuum? We deal a lot, Purdue and Texas A&M and some other universities, we deal a lot with NASA and the space program. And when we were talking space, we're talking a perfect vacuum. It's 30 inches of mercury, right? And when we talk about freeze drying, we want to be in the neighborhood of 28 inches. I mean, we want to be very strong vacuum. So, I mean, it's a real big deal to get the right vacuum level to make the process work as intended. So it's a serious amount of vacuum. You need to have high quality vacuum pumps and chamber seals to ensure you have freeze drying success. When you think, when does water boil? Not always 212, guys. Definitely not. You go down into Death Valley, and guess what? There's more sky. So here's your regular grade of land, and you go down into the valley, you've got more sky. You have more than one standard atmosphere of pressure pushing on the surface area of your kettle. So it's harder to boil the water. It takes more energy. It takes more thermal load to achieve the phase change. If you go up into the mountains in Denver, guess what? There's less sky. There's less than one atmosphere, and it takes less effort to achieve the phase change. So we're playing on this same concept. We're looking for a very specific phase change from a solid to a vapor, and we have to get the pressure level low enough for that to work. If you look at the Zawadzki model, I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with this or not, but this is an outstanding model. Zawadzki Hello.
Eric, are you still on?
Yeah, I'm here. What happened here?
I'm not sure if you froze or what.
I'm sorry.
It's kind of a likely thing to happen when you're talking about freezing things.
I suppose so. Let's see. All right. Did we get to the Zawadzki model?
Yes.
Okay. I don't know why it cut out. I'm here in the Winchester Community Public Library, so I thought we had a better connectivity. Sorry about that. So anyhow, we are looking at the Zawadzki model, and we are looking at the solid and gas plane in this model. It's a really outstanding model, especially if you're, not overly familiar with these types of systems or the triple point or any of that. You can reference this. I've noted it right here, and please feel free to look into that after the session. This is the counterintuitive part. This is the part that confuses folks. You have to add heat. And you say, okay, wait. We took all this effort to prepare our sample and we froze it just how you said. And we got to eutectic point and we did all this stuff to reduce the vacuum down to 28, and now we're going to heat it up. Isn't it all just going to melt, right? Well, we got to be careful because the heat energy from those plates will channel through eutectic ice. If it's truly a eutectic system, then those conduits are going to charge the energy right through the products out to the atmosphere, and it will literally explode into vapors. The product is a conduit as long as it's eutectic, and the ice will undergo sublimation as it leaves the product. Okay, so we have you can literally, this is a beautiful video. I don't have a link to this video, but a block of pure water. Okay, so deionized water can be set on a plate that is 150 Fahrenheit. 150 Fahrenheit undergoing sublimation, and it doesn't melt. It's so cool. It is the coolest phase change you're going to see. I'll see if I can track down the video and send that through. But here's the point. Low pressure in the freeze drying chamber. Okay? And you have the energy on the plate. That heat channels right through this eutectic conduit. And when it gets to the surface, boom, that's your sublimation. If you've got anything, it doesn't matter. I mean, if there's an interruption in this conduit because you have liquid water, if you have not truly reached your eutectic point, you channel through with that pulse of energy, and you hit that water, it starts heating the water. Starts heating the water and it melts everything around it. And everything melts and the process fails. Okay, this is what I'm talking about. It's not going to work if you have liquid water in your food matrix. It will only work if it's truly eutectic. So you need to be able to channel energy through these conduits of crystal, and then it will explode out the surface in a vapor. And that is the way that sublimation can work. When you have established sublimation, you turn up the heat on the plate. You turn up the heat on the plate because guess what? That's a bigger delta T, and it's going to increase your rate of phase change. And so you're going to get a quicker result if you have a high heat on your plate. But you don't do that until you've established sublimation. So it's really, really important, because if you have a very high heat that hits the water, you're really in a mess. And so you really want to make sure that you don't have any liquid water. But if you've established sublimation, think of it like setting up all your dominoes. You turn on that heat, that's knocking the first one over. It gets going, and it really, really can take off. So that's what we're talking about. It's completely different science than pushing water liquid into a vapor. This is solid water crystal going straight to a vapor. Okay, so there's a lot of information, and that's okay. Let's just make sure we grasp the concepts. So get your product prepared, get it frozen and quickly, and eutectic. Those are huge. A serious vacuum, and then go ahead and charge it with some energy. The energy is required for the latent heat of sublimation. And once you've established sublimation, turn it up and let it really be efficient and blow through that water mass, and you're going to be in good shape with your freeze drying. So we need to look at food safety. If you have a product that is contaminated during prep, or during equipment loading or packaging, you've got a food safety risk, okay? Even though the conditions are going to be pretty much in stasis, it's not constantly going to be in stasis. Sometimes you'll have something like a special case cereal with the sliced strawberries, and you eat them freeze dried and they go right into your GI tract. And now you have stomach acid that's going to protect from any kind of vegetative cells. So there is kind of a workaround in some respects, but by and large, you want to treat your potentially hazardous food as potentially hazardous food. And there are a lot of people that are not eating the food from a freeze-dried state. They're freeze drying it for storage purposes, and then they're rehydrating it. And now you have potentially hazardous food product, okay? If your products don't reach eutectic point, then you're gonna have a food safety risk, okay? Because the water is not going to be properly removed. The water will warm up and all the adjacent ice will melt, and the product contacting the warm trays will then encounter thermal degradation. You can have a problem if you don't package it correctly. If you package this in a way that traps too much moisture, that enables microorganism activity during storage, we got to be really cautious of the relative humidity in the room and what's going on in the headspace, and how much headspace are we allowing in these packages. And for that matter, how much of a vapor barrier are we using? So when you think about packaging freeze-dried products, you see a lot of them in these like zipper bags and heat sealed bags and things like that, but not always. Sometimes you see some really poorly packaged freeze-dried items, and they're just taking on moisture because, again, there's a gradient. There's a gradient between the relative humidity in the room, and that moisture content in the product is incredibly low after freeze drying. So you're going to have water rushing into the product, into the food matrix constantly, unless you stop it with effective packaging. Inadequate vacuum levels can really cause problems with freeze drying. And you'll see problems with vacuum pump maintenance, so we'll talk to in a couple of minutes. So if you've not removed the water from the product that you expected to remove from the product, you need to be able to verify that you've still gotten to a point of food safety. Again, rehydrated, potentially hazardous product. It's a risk if that's not treated as a potentially hazardous food product. Corrective actions, a freeze-dried process can fail. It can, and it is possible to refreeze that product and to reach the eutectic point and to rerun the freeze drying process. Technically, it's possible, but it's not commonly done. You can even achieve a safe product, but you've damaged that product so seriously. So I've had people say, "But can it be done? Can it be done?" Yeah, technically, you could do that. But I wouldn't recommend it, and it's not something that you're going to see commonly executed. So a reworked freeze-dried product is just not going to be suitable quality. We've done it. We had a very, very expensive set of samples that had to be done for analysis, and it didn't reach eutectic in one of the small harvest right units. And we had to stop and redo it and try to save that research and run it in a bigger scientific unit. I didn't like doing it, but we could technically do it, and it wasn't going to be eaten anyway. But it was just the point that yes, technically you can do this, but it's not very typical. Equipment considerations. All right, so the way this works is you got a closed system, and you're going to have a vacuum chamber and a freezing chamber connected by a thimble. Okay, and so the freezing chamber is where your product rests, and the vacuum chamber is going to fill eventually with vapor, with water vapor. And when that water vapor hits that vacuum chamber, it can start to collect. Excuse me. As it's collecting, then the available capacity of your vacuum chamber is shrinking, right? So you have this much headspace, and you fill it halfway with water. Now you've only got this much headspace. And so your vacuum efficacy is changing throughout the entire freeze drying process. The freeze drying process is slow, and it takes a long time. I mean, it might take 15 or 40 hours. I mean, it just depends on what the process is. A really, really quick freeze drying process might only take 9 hours, depending on your setup, right? But it's a slow process. And you have to think about the system changes during the process. Do your coils need to go through a defrost? Do you have correct cycling on the defrost to make sure that the system is going to continue to keep temperature? The vacuum oil loses efficacy. The vacuum oil will fail. The viscosity and the tolerance of the oil is going to change with repeated use. And so you have to understand the oil life and really change that vacuum oil as needed. Not just when you think it might be a good idea, but really pay attention and change it before you have a problem. So be proactive in vacuum pump oil maintenance. Low quality vacuum oil is really going to cause poor pump performance. And when you have the poor pump performance, you're not going to get a freeze-dried product. You're going to get a compromised product. Vacuum pump maintenance is the big issue, guys. When you look at these, and I don't care if it's a big, system as long as a school bus, right? If it's a huge roll-in freeze drying system, or if it's one of the little tabletop units, or if it's a scientific unit in between, vacuum pump maintenance, that's the thing that's going to get you. Here's, I was just on campus a few days ago. Here's a couple of harvest rights that I got in 18. And, they have dedicated vacuum pumps, but right next to them, there's spare vacuum pumps, just because we know that those things are not going to last. They're going to be a problem. They're going to, the brush is going to go bad. The oil's going to go bad. The seals are going to leak. They're really, really not well-built pumps, and they require a ton of care and attention to get any useful life out of them. And so anybody who's using these in a serious, regular manner is going to have spare vacuum pumps just sitting on deck ready to go, because you can't forfeit the research. You can't forfeit the product. Okay. So if you're in a mom and pop shop who went ahead and bought one of these guys and said, hey, I'm going to run this and I'm going to freeze dry my whatever chicken breast, that's fine. Freeze dry your chicken breast. But if it's raw chicken going in, it's raw chicken coming out. You didn't perform a kill step. And think about how you're going to clean the inside of that chamber that's interacted with all that vapor, and think about things like what are you going to do the first time that pump fails? Because it's not a matter of if, it's when. Those things are not built for endurance. I mean, I've lived it. I can tell you. So watch out for that. The seal integrity is really, really important, and the use of vacuum grease. What I'm talking about here is vacuum grease that goes right around this interface on the door. And it doesn't matter which door it is, you're going to have some kind of a seal grease that can handle that really, really tight vacuum, that 28 inches. So you need to have a good vacuum grease that's used on that gasket. And that gasket is going to have to be built out of a good material that can withstand major temperature fluctuations, because sometimes they want to crack and sometimes they want to deteriorate. And so changing out that particular seal is really, really important. Another thing to consider is when you look at that being a closed system, you have to close the drain valve. Once that freezing chamber has done its work and the vacuum chamber has done its work and the process is done, then the vacuum chamber is going to be rather full of water, and you need to open up the drain valve, drain it all out. Well, what happens is people fire up the next cycle and they forget to close that drain valve. So now that pump is just running and running and running, trying to pull this massive vacuum on the entire room. The pump's going to burn out. It's not going to work. And so you'll see a lot of people that wreck vacuum pumps just by doing that, because they aren't paying attention to the fact that you've got to close that drain valve in between cycles. So it's really, really important to keep an eye on that. And so know if the equipment has been cared for correctly, and if they've really overworked it. If they've tried to vacuum the entire room and they couldn't do it, well, you're probably going to have to change your vacuum oil because you've overworked that system. Things like that need to be taken into consideration. Equipment programming matters a lot. You want to think about what step in the process are you looking at? Are you ramping? Are you holding? Are you heating the plate? You know, and how are we capturing the data? These units like this have real nice little, no, this one has some data capture here. This one doesn't. So this home unit doesn't have the data capture. This one does have some data capture, but a lot of the larger freeze drying are going to have very nice data capture options. So you're going to need to make sure that there's a record of what was the vacuum pressure and what were the actual temperatures involved, and then have an outline of the cleaning process that are using for those trays, because those trays are going to be food adjacent surfaces, not food contact. Packaging quality. Package quality is the limiting factor on shelf life. That's the limiting factor. So it's got to provide all kinds of barriers: moisture barrier, light, oxygen. It just goes on and on and on. And when you look at these multi-layer laminates with foil, those are great pouches, but it's a bad idea. It is a bad idea to put a window in your freeze-dried pouch. Okay, changes your oxygen transfer rate. It gives you a big fail point where the adhesive is connecting that into the rest of the multi-layer pouch. There's all kinds of issues with light getting into the product. Don't use windows if you can avoid it. I know people like to see the product, but wouldn't you rather have a respectable shelf life that's going to really protect that product integrity? Correctly packaged freeze-dried product can be safely stored at room temperature. Okay, keep it cool and dark. Pouch packs can leak. You have this long side seals, you have the top seals, end seals, and in ROP, you know, your facultative anaerobes, if they're there, they're going to remain in a spore state. If the moisture is absent, you're not going to have enzyme activity. So they're going to be camping out in stasis, but they are going to wake up when conditions become favorable. So got to pay attention to the fact that you didn't get rid of any spores during this process. Okay. All right. That was a lot. And so I'm not sure where we're at on time, but I feel like I was rushing a little bit. Do we have any chat or any questions to bring up about any of this content? Freezing, drying, freeze drying, food safety, equipment, packaging, etc. Still with me? All right.
I'm not seeing any questions, Eric. So thank you so much. And we will be sure that your contact information gets out to all conference attendees.
Oh, hang on, I've got that. I've got that here. There you go.
Thank you. And with that, will conclude our sessions for today. We will pick back up on Thursday afternoon at 1 p.m. Thank you.
Man, sorry I went a little bit late. Sorry about the connection issue.
That's
but,
okay.
I hope you learned some things. I hope it's informative. I hope it was useful.
Thank you.
All right,
Have a
thank
good
you.
night.